Hello there, and welcome back. If you're getting comfortable, maybe the lamps are low, maybe you've drawn the curtains against whatever the night is doing outside. Good, settle in, because tonight's story is one that asks you to be still, slow down. That works best when the world has gone quiet around you. Tonight, we're going somewhere that exists in time more than in distance. A country house in England in the early years of the 1800s. Not a famous house, not a great one, not Pemberley with its 10,000 a year, and its lake and its sweeping park. Not a labourer's cottage either, with a single hearth and a dirt floor. Something in between. A modest country home of the kind that perhaps 1,000 families across England occupied at any given moment in the years between, say, 1795 and 1820. The kind of house where, if you had been born into the right family, you might have grown up. The kind of house where, if Jane Austen had been writing about you, you would have lived your whole quiet, hopeful, slightly anxious life. The family I want you to picture has 5 daughters. The eldest is gentle and beautiful and good. The second is quick-witted and sharp-eyed. The family's clear thinker, the one who will eventually become the most famous of them all. The 2 youngest are loud, restless, absorbed in their own small theatrical pleasures. And then there is the middle daughter, the one between the bright pair above and the silly pair below, the one who is neither pretty nor charming, nor especially interesting to most of the people she meets. Her name is Mary, and it is Mary, more than any of her sisters, who notices the texture of the house she lives in, because the others are too busy being looked at to look. Mary, who is rarely looked at, looks at everything. Tonight we are going to walk through her house with her, not as visitors being received in the drawing room with formal civilities, not as guests at a ball, as something quieter than that. A presence at her shoulder. Someone who can hear the clocks ticking in the empty hall in the long mid-afternoon hours when nothing is happening. Smell the beeswax the housekeeper rubbed into the dining table that morning. Feel the cold draught creeping under the bedroom door at 3 a.m. when the fire has gone out, and there is no one yet awake to set another. We are going to learn what it was actually like to live inside a Regency home, not the romanticized version with the men in perfect tailcoats and the women in flowing muslin in a permanent summer twilight. The actual version, with the chamber pots under the beds and the servants' bells in the kitchen and the smoke from the cheap candles in the back rooms, and also, yes, the music in the drawing room, the late afternoon light on the long sash windows, the particular hush that fell over an English country house when the family had gone upstairs, and only the housekeeper, doing her last round with her ring of keys, was still moving through the rooms. So get comfortable, because tonight you live here. Let us start with the house itself, because the building you are standing in is older than anyone currently living in it, and that fact alone matters more than you might think. It is built of red brick, with stone facings around the windows and the door, 2 stories at the front, with a pitched roof and a row of attic windows tucked under the eaves where the servants sleep. The front of the house is almost perfectly symmetrical, 5 sash windows on the upper floor, a central door below flanked by 2 windows on each side. There is a small flight of 3 or 4 stone steps leading up to that door, with iron scrapers set into the stone for visitors to clean their boots before entering. There is a fanlight above the door, semicircular, with delicate glazing bars, letting a little daylight into the entrance hall behind. This is the architectural language of late Georgian England, repeated across thousands of country homes, modest in itself but recognizable anywhere as the house of a respectable family of moderate means. The land around it stretches further than you might expect. A gravelled approach curves up from a pair of stone gateposts on the road, a lawn with a few mature trees, Behind the house, a kitchen garden walled in old brick, with espaliered fruit trees against the south-facing wall, a stable yard off to one side, where 2 carriage horses and a riding horse are kept, a coach house, a few outbuildings, a dairy, a wood store, a privy or 2 for the staff. Beyond all this, fields. The estate is not large by any grand standard, perhaps a few hundred acres, mostly let out to local tenant farmers who pay rent that, together with what the family's investments yield, makes up the household's income. But to the family inside, it is the whole world. They walk these grounds daily. They know every tree by sight. They have done so since they were children. Now step inside. The entrance hall is not grand. It is a square, modestly sized room, perhaps 15 feet across, paved with flagstones, with a staircase rising along the right-hand wall. The stairs are made of oak, with a turned banister and a wide curving handrail polished to a soft sheen by half a century of palms. There is a long case clock standing against one wall, ticking with the slow, patient sound that you will hear all day in this house. A side table with a salver on it for visitors' calling cards. An umbrella stand. A few framed prints on the walls, but nothing extravagant. The walls themselves are painted a pale colour, perhaps a soft stone or a faded green, with a wooden chair rail running around them at hip height. To the left, a door leads into the drawing room. This is the principal reception room of the house, and the room into which any visitor of consequence is shown. It is not enormous, perhaps 25 feet long and 15 wide. 2 tall sash windows look out across the front lawn. The ceiling is plastered, with a simple decorative cornice running around the edge. A fireplace dominates one wall, with a marble surround and a brass fender. The walls are hung with a striped silk paper, faded slightly by years of sunlight. The furniture is what we would now call period, but to the family living here is simply the furniture. A pair of sofas upholstered in a dark fabric, several mahogany chairs, a card table that can be set up and folded away, a writing desk in one corner, a piano against the inner wall. The piano is a square pianoforte, the kind of instrument that became popular in the second half of the 18th century. Mary practices it every day, sometimes well, sometimes badly, and her sisters complain about both. To the right of the entrance hall is the dining room. This is a more formal space, smaller than the drawing room, but more elaborately decorated. The walls are hung with a deeper colour, a rich red or a dark green, which the period considered appropriate for evening dining by candlelight. The dining table is mahogany, large enough to seat 10 when fully extended, with leaves that can be added or removed depending on the occasion. There is a sideboard against one wall, on which the wine and the silver are kept. An ornate looking-glass hangs above the fireplace, designed to multiply the candlelight when the room is lit for dinner. Beyond these 2 principal rooms there is a smaller parlour, sometimes called the morning room or the breakfast room, which the family uses for ordinary daily life. This is where letters are written, where Mrs. Bennet receives her closer friends without ceremony, where the daughters do their needlework and read in the long stretches of an English afternoon. There is a library, lined with books on 3 sides, and dominated by a large desk, where Mr. Bennet retreats from the household's chatter for hours at a time. And there is a passage leading toward the back of the house, behind a green baize-covered door, that separates the family's part of the home from the servants' part. Beyond that door, the world changes. The polished wood floors give way to flagstones. The decorated walls give way to plain whitewash. The smell shifts from beeswax and lavender to coal smoke, cooking and soap, We will go through that door later in the night, but for now we are staying on this side. Upstairs, 6 bedrooms open off a central landing. The largest is the master bedroom, where Mr. and Mrs. Bennet sleep. 2 of the others are shared by the daughters in pairs, with the eldest sometimes given her own room as a privilege. There is a guest bedroom for visiting relatives, of which there are many, and at the back of the house, up a smaller staircase, the servants' attic rooms, 4 of them, divided between the women and the men by careful spatial arrangements that would have been understood without ever being spoken aloud. That is the house. Roughly 12 principal rooms, a handful of secondary spaces, a kitchen and pantry and scullery in the back, attic bedrooms, and the various outbuildings beyond. To us, looking back, it sounds spacious. To the family living in it, with 5 daughters all approaching marriageable age, it could feel small in ways that the floor plan does not capture. But we will come to that. Now, before we go any further, I want to pause and place this house properly in time. Not just in the year, but in the year. Because the rhythm of a country home in the early 1800s was shaped, more than anything else, by the slow turning of the seasons through the same rooms year after year, decade after decade. The year we are visiting is, let us say, somewhere around 1812. The month is November. The afternoon is already shortening towards an early dusk. There is a thin, damp fog that has hung in the lanes since morning, and is now beginning to settle into the hollows. The leaves on the great oak by the gate have come down in a single windy night last week, and they are still lying in drifts along the gravel where the gardener has not yet swept them. There is a smell of wood smoke from the chimneys, and a fainter smell from somewhere across the fields where a tenant farmer is burning hedge clippings. This is the season the house knows best in some ways. November and the months that follow are the long indoor months. The family will be at home now, more or less continuously, until the weather begins to turn again in March. There will be no extended visits to relatives in distant counties, no journeys to Bath or to the seaside, no summer balls in marquees on the lawn. The horses will be out less. The gardens will be left to the gardener and the rooks, and the family, all 7 of them, will be inside this house together for the long dark stretches of the English winter. The year in a country house was felt as a shape. It was not the year of a modern professional, with its conferences and its quarters and its identical fluorescent days repeating regardless of the weather outside. The year here was the year of light and dark, of warm and cold, of fields planted and fields harvested. You felt it in the rooms. The morning room, which was unbearable in February and beloved in May, the drawing room, which was the heart of the house in winter, and barely used in summer because the family was always somewhere else. The garden, which was a kind of additional room from April to October, and a closed-up space by November. Spring began, in this household, with the first warm afternoon when a window could be opened. Mary would be the first to notice, because Mary noticed things, and she would mention it at breakfast, and her mother would say something dismissive, and Mary would go upstairs alone and open the sash in the back bedroom and stand at it for a few minutes, with her eyes closed, listening to the birds and breathing in the new air. The garden began to wake. The gardener turned the beds. The first daffodils came up by the wall. The fruit trees against the south wall budded. Within a few weeks the family would begin to take walks again, properly, not the bracing winter walks where everyone returned with red noses, but the slow, easy walks where one might pause to look at something and not freeze instantly while pausing. By May, the house had changed entirely. The fires were no longer lit in the principal rooms during the day. The windows stood open. The smell of the garden, of cut grass and lilac and later of roses, came in through every doorway. The daughters spent more time outdoors. Letters were written at the desk by the window with the breeze ruffling the page. The mistress moved her morning meetings with Mrs. Hill from the morning room out onto the bench in the rose garden when the weather allowed, although Mrs. Hill never quite looked comfortable conducting business outdoors and seemed always to be trying to get back inside. Summer was the season of visiting. The family might be invited to spend a fortnight with the mistress's brother in town. They might travel to a relative in another county. The house, when this happened, was left in the hands of Mrs. Gould, Hill and the staff, and it became, briefly, a different building, with no one to keep watch over Mary's piano practice, or the cook's economies, or the master's library. Sometimes another branch of the family came to stay at this house, and the bedrooms filled, and the dinner table grew, and there was an unfamiliar liveliness for 2 or 3 weeks. By the late summer the harvest was visible from the upstairs windows. The fields beyond the lane turned gold, and then were cut, and then stood in stubble. The agricultural year was not the family's work, but it was their backdrop. Their income depended on it, in the form of rents from the tenants who farmed the estate. A poor harvest meant difficult conversations between the master and his steward in the autumn. A good harvest meant a quiet, contented stretch of months. September brought the first cool mornings, and the shooting season began. Gentlemen visited their neighbours' estates with their guns and their dogs, and the dining tables in the area filled with partridges and hares and pheasants in a way that they did not at any other time of year. The master of this house was not, by inclination, a sporting man, but his neighbours were, and he was occasionally drawn into a day's shoot out of social obligation. He returned tired and faintly sour, and was not invited again with any urgency. October was the month of the gathering in. The kitchen garden gave its last produce. The apples were stored in the loft over the dairy in shallow trays. The plums and pears that had not been eaten fresh were preserved in jars by Mrs. Hill and the cook in the long afternoons of the still warm days. The herbs were dried in bunches and hung from the kitchen rafters. The household began, without any particular conscious effort, to draw inwards. The fires were lit a little earlier. The shutters were closed a little sooner. The candles burned a little longer. And by November, where we are now, the house had reached its winter shape. The summer rooms were closed and shrouded under loose covers. The drawing room and the morning room and the dining room and the library were the rooms in use. The fires were lit early and built up late. The family stayed in. The neighbours stayed in. The visits were short and the journeys few. The world contracted to the size of the parish, and the parish of the lane, and the lane led only to this house, and this house was, for the next 4 months, almost the entirety of life. Christmas, in 1812, was not yet the great Victorian festival it would become. There would be a goose for dinner, and perhaps a few extra pies, and a sprig of holly on the mantelpiece, and the singing of carols in the village church. There would not be a Christmas tree, which was still a German custom that had not yet crossed into general English use. There would not be presents in any organised way. The children of the labourers might come up to the kitchen door for small gifts of food. The vicar might come to dinner. The day would be spent quietly with the family together, and would be over by 10 o'clock as any other day was. The deeper rhythm of winter was simply being indoors with each other for months on end. There were no shopping trips, no entertainments, no varied stimuli from the outside world. The same fire burned, the same clock ticked, the same conversations went around, the same daughters sewed at the same chairs, the same mother fussed about the same anxieties. Some people loved this, some people did not. Mary, who lived more in books than in conversation anyway, did not mind it as much as her sisters did. Lydia and Kitty found it intolerable, and talked of little else through the dark months but the assemblies and balls of the spring to come. This was the year, not a year of events, a year of seasons, each one settling into the rooms in its own way, leaving its own residue, and giving way slowly to the next. Now let us talk about money, because money in this house is a constant low note running underneath every conversation, every decision, every choice about who is invited and who is not, every consideration of where the daughters might one day go and who they might one day marry. And to understand this house, you have to understand what its income actually was. The family who lives here, like the Bennets in the novel, has an income of about £2,000 a year. That figure in the early 1800s sat in a particular and very specific place on the social ladder. It was not poverty. To put it in perspective, an agricultural labourer of the same period earned perhaps £25 or £30 a year. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter or a tailor in a country town might earn 50 to 100. A curate in the Church of England, a clergyman not yet promoted to a living of his own, might receive as little as £50 a year, and considered himself lucky to have it. A surgeon or apothecary in good practice might make 200 or 300. So £2,000 a year was not just comfortable. It was, in the strict sense of the word, gentry. It was enough to keep a household with a coach, a few horses, a cook, several maids, a gardener. It was enough to dress the daughters in muslin, to send the family to assembly balls, to entertain the neighbouring families to dinner with proper plate on the table. It was enough to live in every visible respect the life of people who did not have to work. But that was the lower edge of gentry. Above this family there was a vast hierarchy of greater wealth. A solid country gentleman of the better sort might have 3,000 or 4,000 a year. A wealthy gentleman, a man with a substantial estate and good investments, might have 5,000 to 7,000. The truly rich, the kind of man who in a novel would set every mother's calculations whirring the moment he entered the neighbourhood, might have 10,000 a year like Mr. Darcy. And above them the great titled aristocracy with their landed empires and their political power and their incomes of 20, 50, £100,000 a year. Compared to those people, the family in this house was modest. They knew it. They felt it. The ranks above them were close enough to be visible and far enough to be permanently out of reach. And there was something else. Something specific to families like this one, with 5 daughters and no sons. The estate, the house itself and the land around it, was entailed. That word, entailed, did so much work in the lives of so many families that it deserves to be understood properly. An entail was a legal arrangement set up generations earlier that fixed how a property would descend through a family. In this case, the entail was entail male, meaning that the property could only pass to a male heir. With no son, the estate would not go to the daughters when their father died. It would go to the next male relative in line, which in this family's case was a distant cousin, a clergyman, a stranger to the daughters who would inherit the house they had grown up in and would, quite legally and quite probably, ask them to leave it. This is the shadow that falls across every conversation in this household. The mother knows it. She has known it her entire married life. The father knows it and tries not to think about it, and has retreated further into his library year by year as the implications have grown clearer. The daughters know it, in the way that children know things their parents have failed to fully explain but cannot quite hide. The mother's project, her great obsession, The engine that drives her energy and her loudness and her perpetual social calculations is finding husbands for the 5 daughters before her husband dies, not because she is shallow, because if she does not, her daughters will be poor, genuinely poor, dependent on the kindness of relatives. The kind of women who in this period could end up as governesses or paid companions or living in cramped rooms in market towns on a small annuity from a sympathetic uncle, watching their world contract year by year. So when you sit in this drawing room and you hear the mother fussing about a young gentleman who has just moved into the neighbourhood with £5,000 a year, you are not hearing a foolish woman fixated on trivial things. You are hearing a woman who is trying to save her daughters' lives in the only way the world has left her to do it. Pride and Prejudice as a novel has been read for 2 centuries as a love story, and it is one, but it is also just as fundamentally a novel about money and the female anxiety that money produces. And every conversation about a ball, every flutter about a dance partner, every nervous calculation about who has called and who has not, is a conversation about that anxiety wearing its evening dress. The house, then, contains a paradox that you can almost feel in the walls: visible respectability, hidden insecurity, a family that is, by every external measure, established and comfortable, and a future that is, by the only measure that matters in this period, deeply precarious. Which brings us to the texture of the place itself, because once you understand the family who live here and what they are quietly worrying about, you can begin to hear the house properly. And the first thing you might notice, if you stood very still in this entrance hall on a quiet afternoon, is just how much sound there is. People often imagine the past as silent. We picture the candlelit rooms, the slow pace of life, the absence of engines and traffic and electronic noise, and we assume that what was left over must have been a kind of profound stillness. It was not. A Regency country house on an ordinary day was full of small, persistent sounds. They were just different sounds from the ones we know. There is the long case clock in the entrance hall, which we have already met. Its tick is slow and emphatic, a full second between each beat, and it carries through the empty rooms in a way that a quartz clock does not. It chimes on the hour-and-a-half hour with a soft mechanical effort, the bells inside it singing for a moment and then settling again into their patience. There are other clocks in other rooms, a bracket clock on the dining room mantelpiece, a small carriage clock in the morning room. They do not all keep exactly the same time. They do not all chime in unison. There is throughout the day a slight overlapping percussion of time being measured at different rates by different mechanisms in different rooms. There is the fire. There is almost always a fire somewhere in this house, in some room, providing both heat and a soft, constant noise. The crackle of coal, the slower, deeper sound of wood, the occasional pop and shift as a log settles or a piece of coal collapses inward into the embers. The fire in the drawing room, dining room when guests are coming. The fire in the kitchen which never quite goes out at any point in any season because the cook needs it for her work. In winter, fires are everywhere. In summer, only the kitchen fire burns, and the rest of the house has a stillness that the family welcomes after the smoky months. There are the floorboards. Old oak boards that creak in particular places, in particular ways, at particular times. The maid going up the back stairs at 5 a.m. to lay the fires has a sound. The mistress crossing the landing in soft slippers at midday has a different one. A child running, which is forbidden but happens, has a third. After enough years in such a house, you can identify everyone by the sound of their feet alone. There are doors, heavy panelled doors with iron latches. The sound of a door opening and closing in this house is not the soft whisper of a modern door on its hinges. It is a real noise, the latch lifting, the wood swinging, the soft thud of contact as the door reaches its frame. You hear when someone enters or leaves a room 3 rooms away. There are the servants' bells. There is a system of bell pulls running through the house, with a cord or a lever in each of the principal rooms, connected by wires to a row of bells on a board in the kitchen passage. When the mistress rings from the drawing room, a particular bell jangles in the kitchen, and a maid knows immediately which room is calling. The bells are made of brass, and they have a quick, sharp sound, and they stop almost as soon as they have started, leaving the kitchen briefly more silent than it was before. The maid wipes her hands on her apron and goes, "There is the music." The piano in the drawing room is played by Mary, and sometimes by Elizabeth, and very occasionally by Jane. Mary plays the most often and the most painstakingly, working through difficult passages over and over, sometimes for an hour at a stretch. Her sisters tease her for it. Her father, in his library, has learned to read with that sound in the background and barely notice it anymore. Her mother sometimes sighs when Mary plays a particularly long and serious piece, and wishes one of the prettier daughters were at the keys instead. But the piano fills the house in the late mornings and the long afternoons, with the slow, deliberate progress of a young woman trying to master an instrument that is harder than any of her family quite acknowledges. There is conversation. There is always conversation in this house. With 7 women in residence, plus servants, plus visitors, the rooms are rarely truly silent for long. Voices rise and fall behind closed doors. A peal of laughter from the bedroom shared by the 2 younger sisters. A measured exchange between Jane and Elizabeth on the landing, the mother calling for Hill, the housekeeper, with the kind of urgency she applies to everything regardless of its actual importance. A snatch of song from the kitchen, a maid singing as she works, the song breaking off as she hears footsteps approach. And then there is what you do not hear. There are no engines, no machines, no electronic devices, no traffic. The road outside the house carries perhaps 3 or 4 vehicles a day, and each of those is announced from a long way off by the sound of hooves on the gravel and the creak of harness. The country around the house is made of sounds you have to listen for. Birds, the wind in the trees, distant sheep, the occasional bark of a dog at a neighbouring farm, a church bell 3 miles away, marking the hours and travelling across the open fields with a clarity that nothing in our modern world quite matches. At night, the silence becomes deeper, but it is still not complete. The house settles. Wood that has expanded in the day's warmth contracts in the cold with small pops and creaks. The wind moves around the chimneys. The owls call from the trees at the back of the lawn. A vixen somewhere in the fields gives the strange high cry that has terrified country dwellers for centuries until they learn to recognize it. The sounds of a Regency night are not the sounds of nothing. They are the sounds of a house and a landscape doing what they do in the dark, with no human noise to mask any of it. Now let us talk about how the house smelled, because this, more than anything else, is the dimension of the past that we cannot easily access from photographs or films, and that mattered enormously to the way people experienced their own lives. The first thing you would notice on entering this house, if you walked in directly from outside, is the smell of wood smoke and coal. It would be everywhere, in the curtains, in the upholstery, in the woolen carpets. The fires that warmed the rooms and cooked the food were burning every day for most of the year, and their residue settled into every absorbent surface in the building. The family no longer noticed it. They had grown up with it. It was simply what a house smelled like, then the smell of beeswax. The brass was polished too, with a different and slightly sharper smell. The silver, when it was brought out for dinners, smelled faintly of the pumice and rouge with which it had been cleaned that morning. Then the smell of cooking. Even 3 rooms away from the kitchen, the smell of dinner being prepared reached the family from late morning onwards. Roasting meat, boiling vegetables, bread baking, the complex sweet smell of puddings and pies and sauces. By dinner time in the late afternoon, the smell of cooking dominated the whole back half of the house and seeped pleasantly into the dining room as the meal was being brought up. The smell of candles, depending on the room and the occasion, varied between 2 distinct registers. In the principal rooms, when the family expected company or were dining formally, the candles were beeswax. Beeswax candles burned cleanly, with very little smoke, and gave off a faint, pleasant smell that mingled with the wax already on the furniture. They were also expensive, considerably more expensive than the alternative, and were used sparingly in the back rooms, in the kitchens, in the servants' quarters, in the bedrooms when no company was present. The candles were tallow. Tallow was rendered animal fat, usually mutton fat. Tallow candles smoked. They smelled of the kitchens of the slaughterhouse from which the fat had originally come. They needed regular trimming with a small pair of scissors made for the purpose, because the wick would otherwise smoulder and produce more smoke and less light. A tallow candle was, in every sensory respect, a worse object than a beeswax one. But tallow was cheap, and in a household running carefully on a known income, the difference between beeswax and tallow was one of the small daily economies that the housekeeper kept in mind. So a Regency house had 2 different smells of light, depending on which room you were in. The front of the house, the public spaces, smelled of clean wax. The back of the house, the working spaces, smelled of mutton fat lightly burning. After dark, when the candles in both halves of the house were lit, the difference was one of the most reliable ways to know which side of the green baize door you were on without looking. Then there were the smells of bodies. And here we have to be honest. People in the early 1800s did not bathe daily. The technology for full immersion bathing existed in grand houses, but in a household of this scale, it was not practical. Hot water in quantity required a great deal of fuel and servant labour. A full bath was a significant occasion, taken perhaps once a week or once a fortnight in a hip bath set up before the bedroom fire, with water carried up in cans by maids working hard for the privilege. In between, washing was done from a basin with a jug of water on a washstand in each bedroom. Faces in the morning, hands frequently, the rest of the body, in a partial way, when needed. But this was not, to a Regency person, a state of dirtiness. Clean linen was a matter of considerable pride. The linen shifts the women wore against their skin under all their other clothes. The linen shirts the men wore were changed daily or every 2 days, and washed regularly by a laundry maid or sent out to a village laundress. Linen freshly washed and pressed was understood to absorb the body's oils and odours, and changing it frequently was the period's primary method of personal cleanliness. A Regency person who was particular about appearance was particular, above all, about linen. Then there were the smells used to mask. Lavender, in the linen press, between the folded sheets and shirts. Rose water, dabbed at the wrists. Eau de Cologne, which had become enormously popular in the late 1700s and was used by both men and women, applied generously and often pomades for the hair, scented with rosemary or violet, sachets of dried herbs in the wardrobes. The result was that an upper-class person who took care over their appearance smelled on most days primarily of these floral and herbal scents layered over linen that was clean, if perhaps not as fresh as it had been at breakfast, layered over a body that had not been thoroughly washed in several days. And then there were the smells you would rather not think about, but which were part of the daily texture of the house. The chamber pots under each bed, used at night and emptied each morning by a maid. The privies in the garden for the family, and a separate one for the servants. The whole sanitary universe of the period, which depended on careful management and careful timing rather than on plumbing. There were no flushing water closets in this house. Water closets existed by 1800, but they were uncommon, expensive, and largely confined to the very grandest establishments. For a country gentry household of moderate means, the technology of relief was the chamber pot, the chamber, and the close stool. And the smell of these things, despite the careful work of the housemaids and the regular emptying of pots into the soil heap behind the kitchen garden, was a small but real part of the olfactory landscape. So when you imagine yourself in this house, do not imagine a perfumed paradise. Imagine instead a complex layered atmosphere, wood smoke, beeswax, cooking, tallow in the back rooms, beeswax in the front, lavender and cologne and rose water, clean linen and bodies that were not quite as clean as the linen, the faint sweet smell of horses drifting in from the stables when the wind was right, and occasionally less pleasant notes that the family had simply learned not to register, in the way that you learn not to register the persistent low smell of any house you live in for long enough. This was the air they breathed. It was not unpleasant. It was just dense, lived in, old. Now let us speak about light, because the way light worked in this house, the way it filled and emptied the rooms across the course of a day, shaped almost everything about how the family lived. In the morning, the house was cold and dim and slow to wake. The servants were up first, well before the family, lighting fires and laying breakfast and quietly opening the shutters in the principal rooms, so that when the family came down, the rooms would already be filled with whatever daylight the morning could provide. By 8 o'clock, the dining room was warm, and the breakfast was ready, and the family began to drift down at their various speeds. The morning room, where the family spent the late morning hours after breakfast, was a south-facing room chosen for that purpose. The light through its sash windows was bright and direct, and the writing desk by the window was the best place in the house for letters, accounts, or sewing. Mrs. Bennet did her household management here. The daughters wrote to their friends. Light, in the early 1800s, was a serious working asset. You sought it where it could be found. You did your finest work by it. You did not waste it. By midday, the sun moved around to the back of the house, and the morning room dimmed slightly. The drawing room, with its westerly aspect, came into its own in the afternoon, and the family migrated. By 4 or 5 o'clock in winter, or 7 or 8 in summer, the daylight was beginning to fade, and the candles came out. Lighting a Regency house in the evening was a domestic ritual that we have entirely lost. The maids went around with tapers, lighting individual candles in the rooms that were going to be used. They did not light every candle at once. Candles were expensive. You lit what you needed and no more. The drawing room, when the family was sitting in it, might have 6 or 8 candles burning. The dining room, when guests were present, might have a great deal more. because dining by candlelight with company required a level of light that allowed people to see one another and the food. A dinner party for 10 in this house might involve 30 or 40 candles burning simultaneously in branched candelabra on the table and on the sideboard, and the room would be both noticeably warm and noticeably bright by the standards the family was used to. But the standard of brightness was different from ours. A wax candle gives off, by modern measurement, perhaps the equivalent of a 13-watt bulb. 6 candles in a drawing room give the equivalent of a single modern reading lamp. The corners of the room in the evening were dim. People sat close to the candles to read or sew. They drew their chairs close together. They moved slowly and deliberately because the light did not allow for the kind of casual motion we take for granted. This had a powerful effect on how the evening felt. In a modern home with electric light, every room is the same brightness from sunset until the moment you go to bed. In a Regency home, the day was an arc, bright in the morning, dim by late afternoon, pooled into small islands of candlelight in the evening, truly dark at night, except for whatever faint glow remained in the dying embers of the fire. And the fire, in the evening, was the other source of light, and a more important one than the candles in many ways. The fire in the drawing room threw a flickering orange light across the floor and the lower part of the walls. People sat in a half-circle facing it, partly for the warmth and partly for the light. The light from the fire was unsteady, restless, alive in a way that no other light in the room could match. It made faces look different. It made the patterns on the carpet shift and change. It produced shadows that moved when the wood collapsed, when a draught caught the flame, when someone passed in front of it. In bedrooms, after the family had gone up at the end of the evening, there was a single candle by the bedside, often a small tallow one in a flat holder with a finger loop, called a chamber stick. You read for a few minutes by it if you wanted to. You undressed by it. You blew it out, and the room went entirely black, truly black. A country bedroom, behind heavy curtains, with no street lights and no electric glow from neighbouring buildings, was darker than almost any darkness most modern people have ever experienced. And in that darkness you could hear the house in a way you could not hear it during the day. The clocks, the fire in the kitchen, a maid moving on the floor below, someone coughing in the next bedroom, the wind, the owls, the slow patient settling of an old building into another night. Now let us go back to the very beginning of the day, because the morning in a country house had its own particular shape that I want you to feel before we move on. The day did not begin when the family got up. The day began long before that, in the dark, when the first servant's feet hit the floorboards of an attic bedroom, and the work of running a household started again from where it had left off the previous night. It is 5:30 in the morning. The house is entirely dark and entirely cold. Outside, the November sky is still black. The first hint of grey will not come for another hour. The fires throughout the house have been banked down to embers since the maids went to bed, and the temperature inside the rooms has dropped, hour by hour, to perhaps 10 degrees above the temperature outside. The bedrooms are cold. The principal rooms are cold. The corridors are cold. Only the kitchen, where the great fire was banked rather than extinguished, retains any real warmth. In the maid's attic, a single tallow candle is lit. It is the lower housemaid, the youngest of the indoor staff, perhaps 18 years old, whose job it is to be the first up. She rises in the dark, fumbles for her shift and her wrapper, splashes a little cold water on her face from the basin in the corner, ties her hair under a cap, and goes down the back stairs in her stockinged feet so as not to wake the others. The back stairs are narrow and steep, made of bare wood, and they creak under her weight in places she has long since learned to anticipate. In the kitchen she lights more candles. She rakes out the previous day's ashes from the great fire. She lays a new fire with kindling and small coals from the scuttle, sets it alight, and waits a few minutes for it to take properly before piling on larger coals. She fills the great kettle from the pump in the scullery and sets it on the hob. She brings in fresh wood from the wood store outside the kitchen door, where the gardener has stacked it. She sweeps the kitchen floor of yesterday's last dust. The whole kitchen, by 6:10, is beginning to warm and brighten and smell of smoke and tea preparation. Then she moves into the principal rooms, the drawing room first. She kneels in front of the grate, rakes out the ashes into a tin pail, brushes the hearth clean, lays a new fire, and lights it. She does the same in the dining room, in the morning room, in the master's library. By the time the family begins to stir at 7 or 8, 4 fires will have been lit, one in each of the rooms that will be used during the day, and each of those rooms will have begun slowly to warm. Meanwhile, the second housemaid has come down. She and the lower housemaid begin the morning's other work, sweeping the carpets in the principal rooms with damp tea leaves to keep the dust down, dusting the furniture, polishing the brass fender in the drawing room, opening the shutters quietly so that the rooms will be ready when the family appears. The cook comes down at 6. She is the senior of the kitchen staff, a woman in her late 40s named Mrs. Phillips, although her actual name is hardly used by anyone in the house anymore, because every cook in every house was simply called the cook. She has been awake for 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of her bed, mentally going through the day's meals before she rose. She comes into the kitchen, takes the kettle off the hob, makes herself a strong cup of tea, and stands by the fire for a moment before she begins. She drinks it slowly. It is the only quiet moment in her entire day. Then she begins the breakfast. The family will eat at 9, which is the gentry hour for breakfast. The mistress, who keeps somewhat earlier hours than her daughters, may drift down a little before. The cook lays out what has been baked the previous day, slices the bread, sets out the butter from the dairy, prepares ham and cold meats, sets the chocolate to warm, sets a fresh pot of tea brewing, has the eggs ready to cook to order. Breakfast in a Regency country house was substantial but informal. There was no fixed time at which everyone sat down together. People came as they came, helped themselves from the sideboard, sat where they wished, talked or did not talk. The dining table at breakfast was the most relaxed setting in the day's social geography. By 7:30, the master is awake. He rings for his manservant, who brings up shaving water in a brass jug from the kitchen. The master shaves slowly, unhurriedly, by the light of 2 candles and the first weak grey of the dawn through the window. He dresses in a clean linen shirt, a waistcoat, a frock coat. He comes downstairs by 8:20, picks up the newspaper from the salver in the hall where the manservant has already placed it, and goes through to the dining room. Mrs. Bennet is there before him today. She is dressed in a plain morning dress and a fresh cap, and she is buttering a piece of toast and complaining mildly to no one in particular about the weather, which has been damp for a week and shows no sign of changing. The master nods to her, sits down, opens his newspaper, and begins to read. The daughters come down in their own order. Jane is usually first, because Jane is sweet-natured and rises early without fuss. She comes in, kisses her mother on the cheek, takes a small breakfast, and reads quietly while she eats. Elizabeth comes next, having walked in the garden before breakfast, as is her habit even in November, with her cheeks pink from the cold and a sprig of something tucked in her belt. Mary appears in due course with a book under her arm, eats slowly, and reads as she eats. The two youngest, Kitty and Lydia, come down last, often together, often half-dressed, because they have not finished their hair, and full of energy that the rest of the family is not yet ready to absorb. The breakfast hour is in many ways the most pleasant hour of the day. The light is good, the fire is warm, the food is plentiful, the newspaper is being read, and details from it are sometimes passed along the table, a reference to a battle, a piece of London gossip, a new appointment. The world, distant as it is allowed briefly into the room. The mother makes her plans for the day aloud and is mostly ignored. The father reads. The daughters drift in and out of the conversation as the spirit moves them. By 9:30, breakfast is over. The day proper begins. The master after breakfast retires to his library. He will not be seen by his family again, except perhaps in passing, until shortly before dinner. The library door closes behind him, and his presence becomes for the rest of the household a distant fact rather than an active one. The mistress goes through to the morning room and sends for Mrs. Hill. The two of them sit together for half an hour or more, conferring on the day. What needs ordering, what needs doing, which rooms need attention, what is in the larder, what the cook should make for dinner, whether the linen press should be inventoried this week or next, whether a particular servant has been performing satisfactorily, whether the carriage is in good order or needs the wheelwright. Mrs. Hill listens, makes notes in a small book, occasionally raises a point of her own. The mistress frets. Mrs. Hill nods. Decisions are made. By 10, Mrs. Hill is back in the kitchen passage with her list, and the household's business is set for the day. The daughters, meanwhile, scatter to their morning occupations. Jane goes to the morning room with her writing desk and begins a letter to her aunt in town. Elizabeth takes her bonnet and her pelisse and walks out across the lawn and along the lane, 3 miles or 4 miles, and returns by midday with mud on her boots and the slight elation of someone who has been alone with their own thoughts for an hour. Mary goes to the drawing room and begins her morning's piano practice, the same difficult passage repeated for the better part of an hour, working from a printed sonata that her aunt sent her 2 years ago and that she is still only halfway through. Kitty and Lydia, having no fixed occupations of any kind, drift between their bedroom and the morning room, trying on each other's bonnets, making each other laugh, and getting in everyone's way, until their mother sends them out into the garden to do something useful, although neither of them has any clear idea what useful might be. This, more or less, is the morning, quiet, structured, full of the small unhurried activities of a household whose members do not have to leave for work and do not have any pressing external obligations. The morning is the time of writing letters, practicing music, walking, reading, doing the slow work of accomplishments and correspondence and household management. By midday, when the light is strongest, every member of the family is at their own occupation, in their own part of the house, and the whole building has settled into the steady working hum of a Regency morning, at its proper rhythm. This is the morning Mary loves best. The house is quietest in this stretch. Her sisters are at their own concerns. The piano in the drawing room is hers, uninterrupted. Her commonplace book is on the small table beside the instrument, and in between passages, she copies out a sentence from the volume of sermons she has been working through, her handwriting careful and a little cramped. She is alone with her work. Nobody is watching her. Nobody is comparing her to her prettier sisters. Nobody is wishing she were someone else. For these few hours she is simply herself, doing the things she has chosen, and the house is letting her do them. By 1 or 2 o'clock, the morning ends. The family begins to gather again, in the morning room or the drawing room. The post has come. If it is a post day, there may be visitors arriving. There is the question of the afternoon's walks or calls. The day, having been quiet for several hours, begins to gather a little energy again in preparation for the evening. Let us turn now to the woman at the centre of this household, because every Regency country house had at its heart a particular figure, a particular kind of organising intelligence, and that figure was the mistress of the house. She was almost always underestimated. She was, in this case, also genuinely fussy and prone to nerves, and inclined to dramatise. But underneath all of that, she was running a substantial enterprise, and without her, the house simply did not work. Meng. The mistress of a Regency household was, in modern terms, a combination of operations manager, head of human resources, finance officer, social director, and project lead on an indefinite long-term project of marrying the daughters successfully. The fact that she did all of this without holding any official title, without earning any salary, and without receiving anything resembling formal credit, did not change the scale or the seriousness of the work. Each morning after breakfast, she met with the housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, in the morning room, or in the small office off the kitchen passage. They went through the day together, what needed to be ordered, what needed to be done, which rooms needed cleaning, which linen needed washing, what cook should prepare for dinner that day, which depended on what was in the larder, what could be brought in from the kitchen garden, what the butcher had sent up that morning, what the day's expected company was, and how much the household had spent already that quarter on items. The mistress was watching closely. Then there was the question of staff. The maids needed managing. Disputes between them needed adjudicating. New servants, when they were hired, needed selecting from candidates sent by the local agent or recommended by neighbouring families. Old servants, when they retired or left, needed replacing. The wages, modest as they were, had to be paid quarterly, and the accounts kept. This was the mistress's domain entirely, but master might know the cost of a horse. He probably did not know the wages of the kitchen maid. Then there was the larder and the linen press, and the medicine chest, and all the contained worlds of supply within the house. The mistress kept the keys to these on a small ring that hung at her waist, attached to her dress by a chatelaine, and she dispensed from them as needed. Sugar from the locked sugar tin, because sugar was expensive. Tea from the locked tea caddy, because tea was very expensive. Spices, dried fruits, cordials and tinctures and ointments she had made herself or had inherited from her mother. The mistress was for every minor ailment in the household the first physician. She made her own elderflower water, her own lavender salve, her own cough mixture from honey and onions and a little brandy. She knew which servant had a bad knee that needed a poultice once a week. She knew which daughter was prone to headaches and what helped them. Then there was the social calendar. Who had called? Who was owed a call in return? Whose dinner invitation was outstanding? Which neighbouring families needed to be cultivated and which could be neglected? Whose ball was coming up? Who had recently married, given birth, fallen ill, died? And what the appropriate response from this household was to each of those events. The mistress kept all of this in her head, more or less continuously, and adjusted the family's social movements accordingly. And underneath all of this, and giving it all its particular intensity in this house, was the problem of the daughters. 5 of them. None of them yet married. The estate entailed away from them. The mother's mind was always, in some part, working on this, always assessing, always calculating. Was this young man eligible? Was that one rich enough? Had the eldest been seen to advantage at the last assembly? Was the second daughter being too clever, too sharp, in ways that might frighten a suitor away? Was the youngest behaving herself, or making the family look foolish? She watched them constantly. She advised them constantly. She nagged them constantly. And she did all of this, in the eyes of the world, as a woman who was simply rather silly and rather loud, when in fact she was a woman trying to manage the only resources she had to keep her daughters from poverty. It is easy to laugh at Mrs. Bennet. Generations have. But if you sat with her in her morning room for a few hours and watched what she actually did in a day, what she actually held in her head, what she was actually responsible for, you would stop laughing fairly quickly. She was in her own way quite formidable. The household ran because of her. The marriages, when they came because of her. And every drop of nervous energy she expended was, in the end, expended on behalf of her children. One of the things the mistress managed, and that I want to give a moment to before we move on, was the household's correspondence. Because letters in this period were not the casual things they have become for us. Letters were the central means by which a family kept itself connected to the wider world, and the writing and the receiving of letters were treated with a seriousness that we have very largely lost. There was no daily post in a country place like this one. The post came twice a week, sometimes 3 times. A boy on horseback rode out from the nearest market town with the bag and dropped letters at the houses on his round, collecting outgoing letters at the same time. The arrival of the post was an event. Whoever was nearest the door when the boy was heard on the gravel went to meet him. The bag was opened on the hall table. The letters were sorted by addressee and laid out on the salver, and the family was summoned, and each person picked up what was theirs and either read it on the spot or carried it away to a private corner. A letter in 1812 was not free to send. The recipient paid the postage, which varied by distance and by the number of sheets of paper used. A single sheet from London to Hertfordshire might cost a few pence. A double or triple sheet, considerably more. This created a strong economic pressure on letter writers to make every line of every page work. And so they did. People wrote in small, careful hands, filled the page from edge to edge with no margin to spare, and when they reached the bottom of the sheet and still had things to say, they did not start a new sheet. They turned the sheet 90 degrees and wrote across what they had already written, in lines crossing the existing lines at right angles. This was called crossed writing, or sometimes crossing the letter. To us it looks impossible to read. To them it was a fluent practical solution to the cost of the post, and they read each other's crossed letters with something close to ease. Letters were sealed with wax. Small stick of red sealing wax was held to a candle until the end melted. The wax was dripped onto the folded edge of the letter, and a personal seal was pressed into the cooling wax, leaving an impression. Some seals were monogrammed. Some carried a small device or motto. The seal was a way of confirming that the letter had not been opened in transit, although the system was imperfect, and a determined reader along the route could sometimes peel a seal off and replace it with their own wax if they had matching. Mostly, however, seals were respected. The privacy of a closed letter was a powerful social convention. What was written in these letters was the connective tissue of family life. news from a married sister in another county, the progress of a niece's engagement, a nephew's commission in the army, the death of an old neighbour, a request for a recipe, a description of a journey just made or about to be made, the minor gossip of one household passing into another, the depth of feeling between sisters who lived apart, sustained over years and decades by a regular exchange of pages. In a household like the one we are visiting, the mistress wrote regularly to her sister in town, who wrote back with London news. The eldest daughter wrote to a particular friend who had married and moved to the north. The second daughter wrote to her favourite aunt. The younger daughters wrote letters when made to, and otherwise neglected their correspondence in a way that drew steady reproach from their mother. The master wrote to his man of business, to his cousin, to a few old friends from his college days. The volume of correspondence flowing in and out of this house in the course of a month was substantial, and the salver in the hall was rarely empty for long. A letter, when it arrived, was often read aloud. Not always, because some letters were private, but often a letter from a married sister might be carried into the morning room and read out by the mistress to whichever of her daughters happened to be there, with running commentary and exclamations and occasional silences over passages that the mistress thought best to skip. A letter from a friend might be read out by the daughter who had received it, with her sisters listening and asking questions. A letter, in this way, was a small social event. It brought a distant voice into the room. It offered, for an hour, a window into another household in another county, and the family lived briefly in that other household before the letter was folded again and put away, and the letters were kept, almost always kept, bundled with ribbon, stored in a writing desk or a small chest, brought out and reread on quiet afternoons. The letters of a long-married woman might fill several drawers, the accumulated correspondence of decades, the textual record of a life made of many small distant connections held together by paper and ink. Mary, who was perhaps the most thoughtful keeper of letters in her family, had a small box in her bedroom in which she kept every letter she had received from anyone in chronological order, with a small label on each bundle saying who the letter was from and when it had arrived. She reread them in the long winter afternoons when nothing else was happening. She knew them by heart. They were, in some sense, her closest companions. Now let us turn to her husband, because the master of the house, Mr. Bennet in our model, occupied a very different position, and to understand the dynamic of a Regency household at this level, you have to understand what the gentleman of the family did all day, which was by the standards of any working person of the period, not very much. Mr. Bennet rose later than his wife. He breakfasted alone often, with the newspaper. The newspaper, in this household, was a substantial weekly object, perhaps a London paper like the Morning Chronicle, sent out by post and arriving a day or two late. He read it carefully. He read it several times during the day. The world of London politics, of military news from the continent, of trade and crime and obituaries, came into this Hertfordshire house through that paper, and the master read it as his primary connection to a world he had no intention of visiting. Then he went to his library. The library in this house was his territory, absolutely. The women of the house came in, but only on his sufferance. The library was where the estate accounts were kept, where letters of business were written, where he sat in his armchair with a book for hours at a time, where he sometimes received the steward who managed the tenanted farmland, and went over the rents and the repairs and the seasonal questions of agriculture that in theory he supervised. In practice, He supervised them as little as he could get away with. The estate ran more or less by itself, in the hands of the steward and the tenants and the customs of generations. The master collected the income and ratified the decisions and otherwise read his books. This is not unique to him. It is the general pattern of the country gentleman. The defining characteristic of the gentry was, precisely, that the gentleman did not have to work for his income. The land worked, the tenants worked, the investments worked. The gentleman, in return, was expected to manage all of this in a general way, to serve as a magistrate when called upon, to attend to local affairs of government and church, to be present at the right occasions, and dignified at all times. But these duties were, for most days of most weeks, light. They occupied a few hours here and there. The rest of the gentleman's time was his own. And what did he do with it? In a man of intellectual inclination, he read. In a man of sporting inclination, he hunted and shot and fished and rode. In a man of social inclination, he visited his neighbours and entertained at home. Most country gentlemen did some combination of all three. The master of this house was, by inclination, primarily a reader. The library had perhaps 12 or 1500 books, accumulated by his father and his grandfather and by himself, and he had read most of them and reread his favourites, and was quite content in a life that was, intellectually speaking, deeply furnished and, socially speaking, deliberately limited. He loved his daughters. Specifically, he loved one of them, the second one, the clever one, more than the others, and he was perceptive enough to know it and old enough to feel slightly ashamed of it. He found his wife exhausting, and in a way that she never quite forgave him for, he had let himself become her primary tormentor through dryness and irony rather than her partner in the great project of the household. The dynamic between them, by the time we are visiting, had calcified into something neither of them entirely wanted, but neither of them knew how to change. He was kinder than he allowed himself to seem. He worried in private about his daughter's future, although he had not done as much about it as he ought to have. He had not saved, over the years of his marriage, the money he should have set aside for their dowries. He had assumed year by year that there would be time, and that a son would come, and the entail problem would solve itself. Neither of those things had happened. Now he was old, and his hair had gone grey, and he sat in his library with his books and tried not to think about the day which would surely come, when he would die and the house would pass to his cousin Mr. Bin. Collins and his wife and his 5 daughters would have to leave. This is the figure who, in many Regency households, sat at the head of the table in the evening. Genial, urbane, slightly distant, master of the ironic remark, beloved within his small circle, increasingly invisible in the daily work of his own household. He was not a bad man. Let us spend a moment in his library, because the library of a country gentleman in the early 1800s was a particular kind of room, and the contents of it tell us a great deal about the mind that inhabited it. The room is perhaps 15 feet by 20. 3 of the walls are lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, dark mahogany, with a small set of wooden steps in one corner for reaching the upper shelves. The 4th wall has a fireplace and a single tall window looking out across the garden. Heavy curtains can be drawn across the window in the evenings. The floor is a faded turkey carpet. There is a writing desk under the window, with the leather inset slightly worn at the front edge from years of use. There is a wing chair near the fire, a small table beside it for a glass of port, and a footstool. There is a globe on a stand in one corner. There are several small framed engravings on the chimney breast, mostly of classical scenes. What was on the shelves was the quiet inheritance of 2 and 3 generations of intellectual purchase. The classical authors, of course, Cicero in Latin, Virgil in Latin, Horace in Latin. The master had been to Cambridge as a young man, and the Latin had stuck more thoroughly than he sometimes let on. There were the Greek authors in translation now, although he could still struggle through the Iliad in the original if he had the patience. There was Shakespeare in a multi-volume edition. There was Milton. There was Pope, whose essay on Man the Master could quote at length when in the right mood, although he rarely was. There was Johnson, in dictionary form and in his other works, and his Life by Boswell, which had been published about 30 years earlier, and which the master had read 3 times. There was history. Hume's History of England in 6 volumes, somewhat out of date now but still respected. Robertson's History of Scotland, and his History of Charles V. Gibbon, complete, in the elegant edition the master had bought in his 30s when Gibbon was still relatively new and shocking. There was political theory, Locke. Burke, whose Reflections on the Revolution in France the master had read with deep approval. There was economy, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 2 thick volumes, with marginal notes in the master's hand from his first reading. There was theology, although less than there might have been, because the master was not a particularly devout man. The Bible, of course, some sermons by Tillotson and South, a few volumes of Anglican divinity that had belonged to his father. And there were the more recent works, the poetry of Cowper, which had become widely admired, some Wordsworth, although the master found him a little too earnest, Scott, whose poems and ballads had taken England by storm in the past decade, and who had recently begun publishing the prose romances that would soon make him the most successful writer in Europe. The novels of Fielding and Smollett, from his own youth. A few of the more respectable contemporary novels, which the master read in moments when he wanted something less demanding, and books of sermons, of agriculture, of horse management, of natural philosophy, of travel, volumes that had been bought for a particular purpose at a particular moment and never quite parted with. The library accumulated, decade by decade, like the silt in a slow river. What the master did with these books varied. He read the classics rarely now, although he liked to know they were there. He read the histories often, working his way through Hume or Gibbon for the 3rd or 4th time, reading slowly, marking passages. He read the contemporary poetry intermittently, not always favourably. He read Scott avidly. He read political pamphlets and reviews when they came his way, and he wrote occasional letters to friends about what he had read. Reading aloud was in the evenings a household activity. We have already touched on this, but it is worth dwelling for a moment because it was such a distinctive feature of family life in this period. The master, after dinner, would sometimes carry a book through to the drawing room and would read aloud to his wife and daughters. A chapter of a novel, a passage from a travel book, a poem, even, on the rare occasion. The family would settle around him, with their needlework or their cards, and listen. A long novel might be read aloud over many evenings, 15 or 20 pages a sitting, the family making its way through the story together over the course of weeks. This was in its way the closest equivalent the period had to the modern household watching a television series. It was a shared experience. It produced shared references. The characters in the book became, briefly, members of the household. The novels of the period, by the way, occupied a peculiar position in the moral hierarchy of reading. Sermons and history and poetry were respectable. Novels, in many quarters, were not. There was a long-running cultural debate, audible in essays and conduct books and sermons throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th, about whether young women in particular ought to read novels at all. Critics worried that novels filled girls' heads with romantic nonsense, made them dissatisfied with ordinary life, and might even, in extreme cases, lead them into folly. Defenders of novels pointed out, reasonably, that a well-written novel could improve as much as it entertained, and that the alternative for many young women was no reading at all. The debate ebbed and flowed. The novels themselves, regardless of the debate, were widely read. Circulating libraries in market towns and watering places lent novels by the volume to subscribers, and these libraries flourished. Most of the daughters in this house had read more novels than their mother strictly approved of, although they had been careful about which ones they let her see them reading. Mary, characteristically, did not read novels. Mary read sermons. Mary read what she called improving works, foresight sermons to young women, which she had been given by her aunt at 15, and had taken seriously to a degree her aunt had not anticipated, a volume of Hannah More's essays, a book of Christian conduct that she had bought herself with some saved money. She read these slowly copied passages from them into her commonplace book, and tried in her ponderous way to apply their lessons to her own life. She was the only one of the daughters who did this. Her sisters thought it absurd. Her father, when he occasionally noticed what she was reading, was quietly amused. But Mary, in her solemn fashion, was undertaking the most genuinely serious program of self-education in the household, and nobody, not even Mary, quite recognized that this was what she was doing. Now let us think about the daughters more broadly, about what it actually meant to be one of 5 sisters in a house of this size, with no privacy, no career, no realistic possibility of leaving except through marriage, and a future that depended entirely on the choices of men. The first thing to understand is that they were almost never alone. The house had perhaps 12 principal rooms, and 7 women in the family, plus a handful of servants moving constantly through the building, plus visitors who came and went. The notion of solitude, the modern expectation that a person can simply close a door and be by themselves for an extended period, did not exist in the way we know it. Even the bedrooms were shared. 2 of the daughters slept in one room, 2 more in another. Only the eldest, Jane, sometimes had her own room as a privilege of seniority. The rest had no part of the house, at any time of day, that was reliably theirs. This was not unusual. Most families in this period, at every level of society, lived in less private conditions than any modern family in the developed world. The aristocracy in their great houses had genuine privacy because they had so many rooms. The poor in their cottages had none because they had so few. The gentry in their middle position had something in between. There was room enough to be in different parts of the house from each other. There was not room enough to be reliably out of each other's hearing. The effect of this on the daughters was profound. They knew each other completely. They had grown up watching each other dress and undress, learning to do their own hair by watching the eldest do hers, sharing books and shawls and ribbons and grievances. They had no concept of being mysterious to one another. The smallest gesture, the slightest change of mood, the new dress that did not quite fit, the letter that was answered too quickly or not quickly enough, was visible and discussed and understood. For Jane and Elizabeth, the 2 eldest, this was largely a positive thing. They were close in age, close in temperament, deep friends as well as sisters. They walked together, they confided in each other. They protected each other from the worst of their mother's anxieties and their father's distance. The bond between them in any account of this kind of household is one of the rare unmixed goods of the system. For Lydia and Kitty, the two youngest. The situation was different. They were 2.5 years apart, joined at the hip in their pursuits and their preoccupations, both fixated on militia officers and assemblies and ribbons and fun. They formed a unit that excluded the older sisters as thoroughly as the older sisters had ever excluded them. Their conversations were full of references to events the older girls had not been at, jokes the older girls did not understand, plans the older girls were not invited into, and in between, in the gap, was Mary. Mary is the sister who lives in this house most strangely, too old to be a confidant to the younger pair, too young and too unlike them to be a confidant to the older pair. Not pretty in a household where two of her sisters were considered beauties. Not charming in a household where the youngest could enchant a roomful of officers without trying. Not clever in the quick conversational way that her sister Elizabeth was clever. Mary's intelligence, such as it was a serious, plodding, autodidactic kind of intelligence. She read books. She copied passages from books into her commonplace notebook. She made what she believed were profound observations on human nature. She practiced her piano endlessly because it was the one accomplishment she had decided she could acquire by effort, the one thing the prettier sisters could not simply have for free. In the family, she was almost invisible. Her mother barely thought of her. Her father, when he noticed her at all, sometimes amused himself by mocking her gently, in a way that she did not always understand, but always felt. Her sisters tolerated her. Her sisters' friends, when they came to call, looked through her as if she were furniture. But Mary noticed. Mary saw. Mary was the one who could tell you that the housemaid had been crying that morning. Mary was the one who knew, before her mother did, that the new neighbour's carriage had been seen on the road. Mary was the one who heard the conversation through the partition wall between the bedrooms when no one else was paying attention. Mary, the overlooked sister, was the family's secret historian, although nobody, not even Mary herself, thought of her in those terms. And it is Mary, more than any of her sisters, who knew this house. She knew where the floor creaked on the upstairs landing. She knew where the cold draught came in around the dining room window in winter. She knew which of the maids had an admirer in the village and which did not. She knew the exact hour at which her father came out of his library each morning, and the exact hour at which he returned to it after dinner. She knew the patterns of the household with a quiet attentiveness that nobody had ever asked her about, and that she had no particular plans to share. She just knew. She lived in this house with her eyes open. If you are walking through this Regency home with anyone tonight, it with her, and it is worth pausing to say, very gently, that Mary's position, which the family found tedious and which generations of readers have laughed at, was in fact the position of a great many real young women of her time, plain daughters in families with prettier sisters, quiet daughters in families full of louder voices, bookish daughters in households where reading was not the prized accomplishment. They existed in their thousands, across the country, in houses just like this one, and they had inner lives that were, in many cases, considerably richer and considerably more interesting than anyone around them ever realized. Before I go any further, I want to take you back, briefly, to where these daughters came from, because the young women you are watching in the drawing room this evening were not born as they are now. They were children once, in this same house, and the way they were brought up shaped everything they have become. In a country gentry household of moderate means, the education of daughters was, in the early 1800s, a peculiarly informal affair. There were no schools in the sense we now mean. There was no fixed curriculum. There were no examinations. A son, if there had been one, would in due course have been sent away to school at 12 or 13, and from there to one of the universities on a course of formal academic training that the family expected and the wider society had organised. A daughter, by contrast, was educated almost entirely at home by a combination of her mother, her older sisters, occasional visiting masters, and a governess if the family could afford one. The Bennet family in our model could afford a governess only intermittently. There had been one, a young woman named Miss Templeton, who had lived in the house for several years when the older girls were young, and who had taught the daughters their letters and their numbers and the rudiments of French, and who had then left to be married. There had been a second governess after her, less successful, who had stayed for 2 years and departed under circumstances the family did not discuss. Since then, perhaps 8 or 10 years, there had been no governess. The youngest daughters had been taught, when they had been taught at all, by their mother and by their older sisters in a piecemeal, intermittent way that would have alarmed any modern educator. This was not unusual. Many gentry families managed in the same way. The expectation for daughters' education was frankly lower than it would later become. A young woman of this class was expected to read English with some fluency, to write a legible hand, to do a little simple arithmetic, so that she could keep household accounts when married, and to acquire what were called accomplishments. The accomplishments were the visible markers of a young lady's education, and were the things she would be expected to display in company: music of some kind, usually piano drawing, ideally in watercolour or pencil, a few words of French, with proper pronunciation if possible, some knowledge of dancing, plain sewing and fancy needlework, possibly some Italian for those who took music seriously, possibly some basic geography and history if the family was inclined that way. What this education did not include was anything that would have prepared a young woman to support herself in the world. There was no Latin or Greek, there was no serious mathematics, there was no science, there was no formal training in any practical employment. The whole structure of a young woman's education was built on the assumption that she would marry, and that her husband and his household would provide her future, and that her education needed to fit her for that future, and no other. The daughters of this house had received this education in their own particular versions. Jane had taken to drawing more than the others, and had a real if modest talent for landscape sketches in pencil and ink. Elizabeth had read more than her share of novels and history and poetry, and had absorbed her father's library more thoroughly than anyone else in the family, although she rarely spoke about it. Mary had taken on the piano with the painful seriousness of a young woman who had identified one accomplishment she could acquire and was determined to acquire it. Kitty and Lydia had learned little of anything, and had not been pushed to learn more, partly because their mother's energy was elsewhere, and partly because their own inclinations did not extend much beyond fashion and officers. The schoolroom of this house had been a small room on the upper floor next to the bedrooms. It had a worn carpet, a long table where the children had done their lessons, a set of bookshelves with the sort of volumes that governesses had thought suitable for young learners, and a globe on a stand in the corner. The room had been in active use for nearly 15 years. Now, in November 1812, it was largely unused. Mary sometimes came in to read in solitude. The youngest daughters occasionally still kept their work boxes in there, but it had ceased to be a place of instruction. It had become, like so many rooms in long-occupied houses, a place that remembered what it had once been. The childhoods that had taken place in this room had been, by modern standards, remarkably free. The Bennet daughters had not been heavily disciplined. Their mother was not, by temperament, a disciplinarian. Their father had withdrawn from the active business of parenting almost as soon as the daughters were old enough to be entrusted to their mother and the governess. The daughters had spent their childhoods running in the garden, climbing the apple trees in the orchard, putting on small plays in the drawing room, walking out into the lanes with whichever sister they were closest to that month, reading whatever they happened to find on the family shelves, riding the donkey that had lived in the paddock until the youngest sister was perhaps 8, learning their letters and their multiplication tables and their French verbs in the schoolroom, and otherwise being children in a country house in a quiet parish with nobody much watching them. It had been in many respects a happy childhood. They had loved each other. They had loved the house. They had loved the garden. They had not yet understood, when they were young, the financial precariousness that was already shaping their futures. The shadow of the entail had not fallen across their understanding until they were old enough to be told about it, somewhere around the time the eldest reached 14 or 15 and began to be talked about as a marriageable young woman. Mary's commonplace book, which she had begun keeping at 12, contained, among its careful copied passages, a few sentences in her own handwriting from those earlier years, reflections on her own character, observations about her sisters, small attempts at moral self-examination that read to a sympathetic eye, as the early efforts of a serious young mind to understand itself. She had not shown this book to anyone. She kept it locked, with a small key on a ribbon at her neck. It was in some sense the most intimate document in the house, and nobody knew it existed except Mary. This was the foundation that had shaped the young women you now see in the drawing room, the half-formal, half-informal education, the accomplishments practiced but not always perfected, the French that was passable but not fluent, the drawing that was charming but not professional, the reading that was wide but not systematic, the music that was, in Mary's case, the result of more conscious effort than her family ever credited. And under all of these, the long open childhood in a country house, with its garden and its sisters and its quiet rooms, that had given them the inner resources they would all in different ways draw on for the rest of their lives. Before I go any further, let me say something about the actual mechanics of being a young woman in this house, because the small daily labour of putting on the body the world expected to see was itself a substantial part of every day. Clothing in the early 1800s was simpler than the elaborate constructions of 50 years before, when the great hooped skirts and powdered wigs had still ruled fashionable life. But it was still a layered, careful, time-consuming business, and it shaped the way women moved through their days more than almost any other single factor. Begin with what was worn against the skin, a linen chemise or shift, full length, falling to the calf, with short sleeves and a wide neckline. This was the foundational garment, the one that touched the body, the one that was changed daily and laundered relentlessly. A young woman in a household like this might own 10 or 12 chemises, all looking very similar, kept folded in stacks in the linen press and brought out in rotation. The chemise was the period's primary defence against odour and dirt. The body was washed partially. The chemise absorbed the rest. A clean chemise in the morning was a small but precise daily virtue. Over the chemise came the stays. The stays were the period's version of a corset, although a softer one than the constructions of the Victorian era to come, made of stiffened linen or cotton, sometimes with strips of whalebone or wood for shape. The stays laced up the back and provided support, and a certain smoothing of the silhouette. They were not the punishing tight-laced stays of the later 19th century. A young woman in 1812 could move, breathe, walk briskly, and even dance in her stays without any particular discomfort, but she could not put them on alone. The lacing at the back required another pair of hands. Sisters helped each other with stays. A maid helped if there was one. The mistress and the eldest daughter often laced each other. Over the stays came a petticoat, made of fine cotton or muslin, which provided both modesty and a layer of softness under the dress. And then, finally, the dress itself. The Regency dress, as it had developed by 1812, was a high-waisted column of fabric, gathered just below the bust, and falling in a more or less straight line to the ankle. The neckline was modest in the morning, sometimes lower in the evening for formal wear. The sleeves were short or long depending on the season and the formality of the occasion. The fabric varied considerably by purpose. Morning dresses were often made of plain muslin or cambric in white or light colours. Walking dresses were heavier, in wool or sturdier cottons, suitable for the mud and weather of country lanes. Dinner dresses were finer with more elaborate trimmings. Ball gowns were the lightest and most decorative of all, in figured muslin with embroidery or applied trims. A young woman of this household might own at any given time perhaps half a dozen dresses, 2 or 3 for everyday wear in the morning, 1 or 2 for walking out, 1 or 2 for dinner with company, 1 or 2 ball gowns of varying age and condition. The number sounds small to us, accustomed as we are to wardrobes containing dozens of garments, but each of these dresses was treated with care, was made or remade by a local seamstress over the course of years, and was understood to last considerably longer than any modern garment. Dresses were remade regularly. A dress that had become unfashionable in cut could be taken apart, the fabric repurposed, and rebuilt into a new shape. A dress that had become tired in colour could be dyed. A dress that no longer fitted could be passed down to a younger sister, or altered, or sold to a maid. Nothing was thrown away. The economy of fabric was careful, sustained, and visible in the small alterations and patches and trim changes that any close inspection of an actual dress from this period reveals. Over the dress, depending on the situation and the temperature, came any of several outer layers. A spencer, which was a short jacket cut to the high waist of the dress, was popular for daytime walking. A pelisse, which was a long-sleeved coat reaching the hem of the dress, was warmer and more substantial. A shawl of cashmere or wool or fine-fringed cotton was almost universal, draped over the shoulders for warmth or thrown over the head for outdoor walks in light weather. A cloak full and heavy was for serious cold or for travel. Stockings of cotton or wool gartered above the knee. Slippers of soft leather indoors with thin soles. Walking shoes for outdoors, sturdier, lacing up the front. Pattens, the iron-framed overshoes for genuinely muddy weather. Gloves, almost always of kid leather or cotton. A bonnet for outdoors tied under the chin with ribbons, the brim shielding the face from sun and weather. The hair was its own production. A young woman's hair in this period was almost always pinned up. Loose hair was for childhood, or for the bedroom, or for very informal moments. By the morning of any day she would be seen by anyone outside her family. A young woman's hair had been brushed, divided, and pinned into some arrangement of curls or coils or twists at the back of the head, with a few softening tendrils at the temples. The work took half an hour or more, sometimes considerably more, and was usually done in front of a small glass, with the help of a sister or a maid for the parts at the back where the hands could not reach. A married woman, additionally, covered her hair with a cap, a small construction of fine linen and lace that signalled her married state and that stayed on her head at almost every hour she was awake. So the mourning for the daughters of this house included the slow, careful business of becoming presentable, the chemise put on, the stays laced, the petticoat, the morning dress, the hair pinned, the cap in the case of the mother, the shawl over the shoulders if the room was cool. By breakfast time, every member of the female family had been working on her appearance for 40 minutes or an hour, and the body that arrived at the breakfast table was a body that had been carefully and methodically constructed for the eye of the day. Then there was the laundry, because the linen, the chemises, the petticoats, the stockings, the shifts all needed washing constantly, and the work of laundering them was one of the great hidden labours of every household in the period. A larger establishment had a dedicated laundry maid who worked full-time on this. A household of this size sent its laundry out to a local laundress in the village, who took in the family's washing once a week, returned it in baskets several days later, and was paid by the bundle. The laundress was, in most country places, a particular figure, often a widow or a married woman supporting a family, who built a small business out of the linen of half a dozen surrounding houses. The day on which the family's laundry came back, all freshly washed and pressed and folded, was a quietly important domestic moment. The linen press in the upstairs corridor was opened. Clean garments were placed inside. The fresh smell of soap and lavender filled the corridor for a few hours. The mistress checked off the inventory and noted what had been damaged or lost. This is the daily backstage of a young woman's appearance. The dress that walked into the drawing room had behind it hours of dressing, days of laundering, weeks of mending, months of remaking, and a whole hidden infrastructure of women's work that the dress itself revealed nothing of. To look effortless was the goal. To have looked effortless required enormous, continuous, almost invisible labour. Now let us go through the green baize door into the other half of the house. Because while the family lives upstairs and downstairs in the principal rooms, there is a second household running in parallel with theirs, in the back of the building, which they barely think about and which they could not survive a single day without. The servants in this house number perhaps 6 or 7 in total. There is Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, the senior woman of the staff, who has been with the family for over 20 years, and who knows the household's workings as deeply as the mistress herself, possibly more deeply. There is the cook, who works with 2 assistants, a kitchen maid and a scullery maid, the latter at the very bottom of the indoor hierarchy, and responsible for the worst of the dirty work. There are 2 housemaids, who clean the principal rooms and tend the bedrooms and lay the fires and empty the chamber pots in the early hours of every morning. There is 1 manservant who serves as a general male presence, doing the work that requires lifting and reaching and travelling, and who in this household also doubles as the butler when company comes. There is a coachman who lives in rooms above the stables with his wife, and who looks after the horses and drives the family carriage. There is a gardener, an older man, who lives in a cottage on the estate. That is the staff. 7 people, give or take, who work in this house. And their lives, although they happened in the same building as the family's, were almost entirely invisible to the family itself. They woke before the family. The first servant up, usually a housemaid, was up by 5 in the morning in summer, and by 5:30 in winter. She came down the back stairs in her shift, and her wrapper lit a candle in the kitchen passage raked out the previous day's ashes from the kitchen fire, laid a new fire and set it going, filled the great kettle, and put the bread out. By the time the cook came down at 6, there was hot water available, and the kitchen was beginning to warm. By the time the master and mistress came down for breakfast at 8 or 9, the housemaids had been at work for 3 or 4 hours already, lighting fires in the principal rooms, opening shutters, sweeping carpets with damp tea leaves to keep down the dust, dusting the furniture, polishing the brass. They worked through the day. The cook prepared meals. The kitchen maid prepared vegetables, plucked birds, scaled fish, did the heavy preparation that the cook would then transform. The scullery maid washed pots, washed dishes, scrubbed the kitchen floor, hauled water, fetched coal. The housemaids did the upstairs work, the bedrooms in the morning, the principal rooms throughout the day, the laundry on its appointed day, the ironing, the linen mending in their evening hours when the family did not need them. The manservant answered the door, polished the silver, served at table, ran errands into the village. The coachman tended the horses, prepared the carriage when needed, and worked in the stables. The gardener tended the kitchen garden and the lawn and the flowers and the fruit trees against the south wall. They worked late. The kitchen fire was banked but not extinguished at night. The last servant to bed was usually the cook, who finished setting up for breakfast around 10 or 11 in the evening. And then the house went quiet, and the servants slept in their attic rooms, with their candles blown out, on beds that were less comfortable than the family's by every measurable standard, but which they were, in most cases, profoundly grateful to have. Their wages were modest. A good housemaid in this period might earn 10 or 12 pounds a year, plus her board and lodging and what was called her tea and sugar allowance, which was a small additional sum. A cook of moderate experience might earn 15 to 20 pounds. The housekeeper, the senior woman, perhaps 25 to 30. The coachman, with his particular skills, might earn 30 or 35. These wages were, in the cash economy, trivial, but the value of the position was not in the cash. It was in the security. A housemaid in a respectable family had a roof over her head, 3 meals a day, decent clothes, a warm bed, and a regular, if small, income. By the standards of her class, this was substantial good fortune. The alternative for many young women was agricultural labour or factory work or worse. A place in a respectable household was worth holding on to. Many of the servants in this house were young. The 2 housemaids were probably in their late teens or early 20s. The kitchen maid was 16. The scullery maid was perhaps 14, and had been sent into service as soon as she was old enough to do the work, by parents who could not afford to keep her at home. They had come from local farms or from neighbouring villages. They had been engaged through agencies, or through informal recommendation from one family to another. They had walked with their small bundles up the gravel drive to the kitchen door and presented themselves to the housekeeper, and been shown to their attic room and started work the next morning. Some of them stayed for years. Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, had been in this house since she was 22 and was now 45. She had outlasted 3 of the gardeners and seen something in the order of 15 housemaids come and go. The relationship between the family and the servants was a particular kind of intimacy. The servants knew everything about the family. They knew which daughter cried at night. They knew when the master had been drinking too much port. They knew the contents of the master's chamber pot before he himself was awake. They knew when the mistress was anxious about money, because they had seen the way she talked to the cook about reducing the meat order. They knew often before the family did. Who was in love with whom, who was angry with whom, what the day's weather inside the house was likely to be. They processed all of this knowledge in the kitchen and the servants' hall, in conversations that the family never heard. But they spoke to the family, when they spoke to them at all, with a particular formal politeness that disguised the depth of what they actually knew. A maid did not become a confidant to the daughters she dressed. A cook did not gossip with the mistress about the affairs of the household. A coachman did not opine to the master about the running of the estate. Information flowed up and down the staircase in the strangest of ways. The family knew almost nothing about the servants beyond their names and their immediate work. The servants knew almost everything about the family but were trained to behave as if they knew nothing. This was the system. It worked more or less for everyone involved. The family received the labour. The servants received the security. The fiction of separation was maintained on both sides. And underneath that fiction, in the kitchen and the attics and the back stairs and the laundry yard, a whole second household lived its life inside the same walls, with its own friendships and rivalries, its own loves and griefs, its own small celebrations and small sufferings, almost entirely invisible to the family upstairs. Let us spend more time in the kitchen, because the kitchen of a Regency country house is one of the most underappreciated rooms in the whole architecture of the period, and it deserves a proper visit on its own terms. We have walked past it. Now let us walk in. The kitchen is in the back of the house, separated from the family's part of the home by a passage and the green baize door. You approach it down a flagstone corridor, past the door of the housekeeper's small office, the still room, past the door of the larder, and through a wider doorway into the room itself. The first thing that hits you, before any visual detail, is the smell. The kitchen smells at all hours of cooking and wood smoke and a faint trace of soap from the scullery next door. By midday on a working day, with dinner in preparation, the smell becomes complex and layered: roasting meat, boiling vegetables, onions in butter, the sharp note of vinegar in a sauce, the deep sweet smell of pastry baking. The smell of a kitchen at full work is not a single smell. It is a small atmosphere all its own. The room is large by the standards of the rest of the house, perhaps 25 feet long and 15 wide. The floor is flagstone, scrubbed weekly with sand and soap and water, worn smooth in particular places by years of use. The walls are whitewashed, although the white has yellowed somewhat above the great fireplace and around the range from years of cooking smoke. The ceiling is low compared to the principal rooms, with heavy oak beams crossing it. From these beams, on iron hooks, hang bunches of dried herbs and strings of onions, and the occasional ham wrapped in cloth. At one end of the room is the great fireplace, or rather, what was once the great fireplace, and has now been partly modernized. The original hearth, built when the house went up perhaps a century earlier, was a wide open arch with a spit for roasting and a swinging crane for hanging pots over the fire. By 1812, this older system has been partly supplanted by a closed iron range, fitted into the space, with an oven on one side and a hot plate on top and a roasting fire that can be regulated more precisely than the open hearth ever permitted. The cook prefers the range for most things. She still uses the open hearth for roasting on a spit, because nothing else gives quite the same flavour to a joint of meat, but the range is where the day's fine work is done. In the centre of the room is the great kitchen table. Solid pine, scrubbed white by years of work, perhaps 10 feet long. This is where everything is prepared. Vegetables chopped here, pastry rolled out here, birds plucked here, sauces stirred in their bowls here. The table is the kitchen's central organ, and at almost any hour of the working day there is at least one person standing at it doing something. Around the walls are the working surfaces and the storage. A dresser holds the everyday plates and dishes. Open shelves carry the cooking pots and pans, in graduated sizes from the small saucepans for sauces up to the great cauldron used for boiling on washing day or for making preserves in the autumn. A row of hooks holds ladles and skimmers and large spoons. A rack on one wall holds knives, in graduated sizes from the small paring knives up to the long cleavers used by the cook on heavy joints. Off the main kitchen, through a low doorway, is the scullery. This is the room where the dirty work happens. It is smaller than the kitchen, with a stone sink set against one wall, fed by a pump that brings water up from the well outside. The scullery floor is also flagstone, but it slopes slightly towards a drain in one corner, because the scullery floor is wet for most of the day. This is where the pots are washed, where the dishes are rinsed, where the vegetables are peeled, where the fish is scaled, where the chickens are plucked and drawn. The scullery maid, the youngest member of the staff, spends most of her working day in here, and her hands in November are red and rough from the cold water she works with constantly. Off the kitchen on the other side is the larder. This is a small room deliberately cool, with a stone-flagged floor and a north-facing window covered in fine wire mesh to keep out flies. The larder is where cold food is stored. Dairy in covered earthenware bowls, cooked meats under glass domes, pies and tarts on shelves, pots of preserves and pickles, hams hanging from hooks in the ceiling. The larder is, in effect, the household's refrigeration, achieved by careful design rather than by any mechanical cooling. It works well enough. Food kept properly in the larder lasts considerably longer than it would in a warmer space. Then there is the still room. This is the housekeeper's domain rather than the cook's, although the line between their territories is sometimes blurred. The still room is where preserves are made, where cordials and tinctures are distilled, where small medicines are prepared, where soap is sometimes made, where candles are made if the household is making its own rather than buying them. Mrs. Hill spends a considerable part of her working life in the still room, with her notebooks of recipes and her small careful equipment. She makes elderflower wine in season. She makes raspberry vinegar. She makes a particular cough syrup of honey, vinegar, and herbs that the family swears by. She bottles her preparations carefully, labels them in her neat hand, and stores them on the shelves that line the still room walls. Behind the kitchen is the kitchen yard, with the well, the wood store, the coal shed, the privy for the staff, and a path leading to the kitchen garden beyond. The kitchen garden is the cook's other principal source of supply. It is walled in old brick, with the south-facing wall used to grow espaliered fruit trees, and the rest of the space divided into beds for vegetables and herbs. In November there is not much growing, but there are still cabbages and leeks and the last of the parsnips in the ground, and the gardener brings them in as the cook requests them. The food itself, prepared in this kitchen, was substantial and varied. Breakfast we have already met. The middle of the day, around 1 o'clock, there might be a small luncheon, though luncheon was not yet the structured meal it would become later in the century. A piece of cold meat, some bread, some cheese, fruit, perhaps a small glass of wine, something to fill the long stretch between breakfast and dinner. Dinner, at 4:30 or 5, was the main meal of the day. We have heard about its composition. Several courses, several dishes per course, a generous spread laid out across the dining table. The cook's whole day, in its underlying structure, was organised around getting dinner ready by the appointed hour. After dinner, in the evening, there might be tea with cake or biscuits around 6 or 7, and then later, around 10 o'clock, there might be a small supper of cold meats and cheese and bread for those who wanted it. So the household ate, in total, 4 or 5 times a day. Although only dinner was a full meal in the modern sense, what was eaten depended on the season and the available supply. In autumn and winter, when we are visiting, the diet was heavy on roasted and stewed meats, root vegetables, dried fruits in puddings, preserved fruits in tarts. Beef and mutton dominated. Game, when the master or his neighbours had been shooting, supplemented the supply. Pigeons being plentiful and relatively easy to obtain. Fish, when the local supply allowed, although in this Hertfordshire neighbourhood, fresh fish was a rarity in winter and salt fish more common. Bread was baked 2 or 3 times a week in the house, by the cook or the kitchen maid in the oven beside the range. Butter came from the dairy, made from the milk of the household's 2 cows. Cheese, similarly, was made on the premises in small quantities, and bought in larger quantities from a local farmer for everyday use. Eggs came from the hens kept in the kitchen yard. Tea and coffee and chocolate were imported, expensive, and treated accordingly. The tea in particular was kept under lock and key by the mistress, and dispensed in small spoonfuls at her direct command. Sugar, also imported, also expensive, was treated with the same care. The labour of running this kitchen was relentless. The cook was on her feet almost continuously from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. The kitchen maid did the heavy preparation. The scullery maid did the cleaning and the fetching and the carrying. Mrs. Hill, when she was not in her still room or in her office, was in the kitchen, overseeing, advising, occasionally redirecting. The kitchen produced 4 or 5 meals a day for 13 or 14 people, year-round, in winter and summer, in good times and difficult times, with the same equipment, by the same human effort, day after day after day, and it produced, on the day we are visiting, a perfectly respectable November dinner of mutton and vegetables, and a pigeon pie and a sweet pudding, which would arrive in the dining room at 4:30 exactly, served by the manservant under Mrs. Hill's quiet direction, while the family, having gathered in the drawing-room after the second gong, made their way through to take their seats. Before we go out into the wider neighbourhood, I want to spend a little more time on the part of this house that is not the house itself. I mean the garden, the grounds, the paths and lanes that surround the building, the world just outside the windows. Because for the daughters of this family, in particular, the garden was where they did the majority of their thinking, and the lanes were where they did the majority of their feeling. The garden begins immediately behind the house. A gravelled path leads from a back door, across a small paved area, and into the kitchen garden, which is the working garden, where the cook gets her vegetables and herbs, and where the gardener does most of his daily labour. Beyond the kitchen garden, through a low gate in the brick wall, is the pleasure garden, which is the garden in the proper sense of the word. The pleasure garden is not large by the standards of the great houses, perhaps 1.5 acres. There is a lawn, kept cropped by the gardener with a hand scythe, with a small ornamental tree at its centre that the eldest daughter remembers being planted when she was 7. There are flower borders along 2 sides, planted in the layered cottage garden style of the period, with a mixture of perennials and shrubs that bloom in succession from April to October, roses against the south wall, a herbaceous border on the east side that catches the morning light, a laurel hedge at the back marking the boundary, A small grove of birch trees in one corner, planted by the master's grandfather, now mature and beautiful in autumn. There is a path that winds through the garden and brings you eventually to a small wooden bench under one of the birch trees. This is the family's favourite outdoor spot. The eldest daughters sit on this bench in summer with their books and their sewing, and even in November, on a fine afternoon, one of them might still walk out and sit there for a few minutes, watching the rooks come in to roost in the trees beyond. Beyond the pleasure garden, through another gate in the wall, you enter the lane. The lane runs along the back of the property, past several other gentry houses at distances of half a mile or a mile, and eventually leads in one direction to the village, and in the other direction to a small wood, and beyond it to open fields. This lane is where the daughters of this family take their walks. Walking in the early 1800s was one of the few forms of vigorous outdoor exercise considered properly available to a young woman. Riding was permitted but expensive in horses. Sport, in the modern sense, was not yet imagined for women. Walking was free, healthful, did not require any particular equipment beyond stout shoes and a bonnet, and could be undertaken in any weather that was not actively dangerous. The country gentlewoman walked almost universally, and walked considerable distances, and considered it one of the genuine pleasures of country life. Elizabeth, in this household, was the great walker. She would set out in the morning, often alone, and cover 3 or 4 miles before breakfast. She walked in all weathers. She walked when she was angry. She walked when she simply wanted to be away from the house and her mother and the unending drawing-room conversations. The lanes around this property, every turn of them, every gate, every changing view across the fields, were as familiar to her as the rooms of the house itself. She knew where the first violets came up in spring. She knew where the foxglove grew along a particular hedge in June. She knew which of the gates always stuck and required a particular jolt with the hip to open. She had in her walks a private geography that nobody else in her family fully shared. That Jane walked with her sister sometimes, when Elizabeth was willing to slow her pace. Jane preferred shorter walks, in the garden or just along the immediate lane, and was less likely than Elizabeth to set out in genuinely difficult weather. Mary walked rarely. The 2 youngest walked when they had to and complained about it the whole time. The 2 eldest walked because walking was, for them, one of the few activities they could undertake that felt genuinely free. The lanes themselves had their own beauty, even in November. The hawthorn hedges were bare now, the leaves down, but the dark twiggy shape of them along the field edges had its own austere appeal. The wide ploughed fields beyond the hedges showed the brown earth in long furrows. Crows and rooks moved across the empty acres, sometimes, broke from cover and ran along a furrow before disappearing into a hedge. The sky was high and grey and full of weather. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from the cottages in the village. You could walk for an hour out here without meeting another soul, or you might meet a tenant farmer riding back from his fields who would touch his hat to you and pass on. You might meet the village butcher's boy with a basket on his arm, walking back from delivering meat to a neighbouring house. You might meet a family of labourers' children walking home from gleaning in a stubble field. The lane was, despite its quietness, a working road, and it carried throughout any given day the small traffic of the parish about its business. In a different season, the same lanes were entirely transformed. In spring, the hedges came alive with the green new leaves and the white of the hawthorn blossom. In summer, the wild roses bloomed in the hedgerows, and the dog roses and the honeysuckle and the lanes were full of bees and butterflies. In autumn, the hedges were thick with blackberries that the labourers' children gathered in baskets, and the rosehips turned bright red, and the trees along the field edges put on the slow extravagance of their colour change. The country walked through patiently across the seasons, gave the people who walked it a sense of time and rhythm that no city dweller ever quite acquires. This is the world that the daughters of this house could enter, almost any day they wished, simply by stepping out of the back door, crossing the garden, and going through the gate. It was their reliable refuge. It was, for Elizabeth particularly, something close to the centre of her inner life. The hours she spent in those lanes, alone with her thoughts, walking off her irritations and walking towards her decisions, were probably the most important hours of her education. They had not been taught to her by any governess. They had been taught to her by herself, through the simple discipline of going outside and walking and paying attention. Now let me speak briefly about something that runs underneath every sustained domestic existence in this period, and that we have not yet properly addressed. I mean illness. Because illness, in 1812, was not the manageable, mostly defeated thing that it has become in our own time. Illness was a regular visitor in every household, including this one, and it shaped daily life in ways that we would now find shocking. The basic fact is that medicine, in the early 1800s, was almost powerless against most serious diseases. The germ theory of infection had not yet been developed. Antibiotics did not exist. Vaccination existed only for smallpox, and was still spreading slowly across the country, although both Edward Jenner's vaccination and the older inoculation method had begun to make a real difference to that one disease. For everything else, doctors had limited tools: bloodletting, which they still believed in, purging, the application of leeches, a pharmacopoeia of vegetable and mineral preparations of widely varying effectiveness, common sense, sometimes, bed rest, very often, time, mostly. The doctor's principal contributions in many cases were to keep the patient warm, to keep the fever down with cool cloths, to keep the patient hydrated, and to wait to see what would happen. When somebody in this house fell ill, the response moved in stages. First, the mistress and Mrs. Hill brought out the home remedies: honey and onion for a cough, mustard plasters for a chill on the chest, elderflower water for a fever, a herbal infusion for a headache. The mistress's medicine chest, which we have already met, was the first line of treatment, and for a great many minor illnesses it was sufficient. A cold ran its course, a mild fever resolved, a child's stomach complaint passed. If the illness did not resolve, or if it appeared more serious, the apothecary was sent for. The apothecary was a kind of medical practitioner less elevated than a physician, but more accessible. He worked in the market town. He kept a shop where he prepared medicines from his own stocks of dried herbs, mineral salts, and prepared compounds. He visited patients at their homes when called. His fees were modest. He was, for most ordinary illnesses, the practical face of medicine in this neighbourhood. If the illness was more serious still, a surgeon was called from a larger town. The surgeon dealt with injuries, with skin complaints, with the setting of broken bones, with the lancing of boils, with the pulling of teeth. He was distinct from the apothecary and from the physician, although in country practice the lines were sometimes blurred. The surgeon was respected but not socially elevated. He worked with his hands. He was paid by the visit. If the illness was very serious, and if the family could afford it, a physician might be consulted. The physician was the elite of medical men. He had been to university. He had a Latin diploma. He prescribed but did not generally prepare medicines himself, leaving that to the apothecary. He charged considerable fees. He was treated, socially, as a gentleman, and was received by the family in the drawing room rather than at the back door. In a parish like this one, there was no resident physician. The nearest were 30 miles away in the larger county town. To send for a physician was a significant step, taken only in genuine extremity. What happened when illness was serious enough to require all of this attention? The whole rhythm of the household altered. The patient was put to bed in the bedroom and remained there. A maid was set to sit with the patient, sometimes day and night. The fire in the bedroom was kept going continuously. Light food was prepared. The other members of the family came and went, depending on the contagion of the illness. The sound of the house dropped. The piano was not played. Loud voices were hushed in the corridors. The whole texture of daily life shifted into the slow, tense, attentive mode that any prolonged illness produces. And the family waited. Sometimes the patient recovered, slowly, over a period of days or weeks. Sometimes more rarely now than 100 years before, but still often enough that every family had stories of it. The patient did not. The mortality of the period was real. Mothers died in childbirth. Children died of fevers. Adults died of consumption, of pneumonia, of typhus, of 100 other illnesses that have now become rare or curable. Every family this size, looked at across a generation, contained the empty places of children who had not survived to adulthood. The Bennet family in our model has had its own such losses. There were, originally, 6 children rather than 5. A son had been born between Mary and Kitty, and had died at 3 of a fever that nobody could explain or stop. The mother had not entirely recovered from this, although she rarely spoke of it now. The empty grave in the churchyard with the small stone was visited occasionally by Jane on her way back from morning service. This was the constant, unspoken backdrop of life in 1812. Health could not be assumed. Recovery could not be guaranteed. A cough that began on a Monday could be a cold by Wednesday, a fever by Friday, a serious illness by the following Monday, and a death within a fortnight. The slowness of medical response, combined with the limited effectiveness of what could be done, meant that every family operated, on some level, with a sustained vigilance about the well-being of its members that we no longer fully understand. When the mistress fussed about a slight cough in one of her daughters, when she pressed extra shawls upon them in cool weather, when she made elderflower water at the first sign of a fever, she was not being merely fussy. She was responding to a world in which fussiness was, in the absence of any more powerful tools, a serious form of love. Now let us widen the view a little, because while we have been inside this house, I have allowed you to forget that it sits inside a wider world, and that wider world is part of every day's experience for the people who live here. The house sits in a parish. The parish is the most important unit of local life in early 19th century England. It has a church at its centre, a vicar or rector who runs the church, a population of perhaps several hundred souls living in the village and on the surrounding farms, and a set of physical and human relationships that bind everyone in it together, whether they like it or not. The parish is the local government, the social registry, the welfare system, the marriage market, and the gossip exchange, all in one. The parish church stands on a small rise about a mile from this house, visible from the upstairs windows on a clear day. It is a stone building, mostly medieval in its bones, with later additions. The tower rises above the surrounding trees. Sunday morning, every Sunday, the bell rings out across the fields and lanes, calling everyone to worship. The family in this house can hear it from their breakfast table. The village itself, the main settlement of the parish, is 2 miles down the lane. It has perhaps 50 houses, most of them small cottages occupied by labouring families, several larger houses occupied by the more prosperous tradesmen, an inn called the Crown, a smithy, a small general shop run by a widow, a baker, a butcher, a tailor, and the vicarage where the vicar lives with his wife and his 3 children. The village has been there for at least 800 years. The lane between the house and the village has been there at least that long. Some of the older cottages were standing in the time of the Stuarts. Then there are the surrounding farms. Half a dozen tenant farmers rent land from the master of this house and from the 2 or 3 other landowners in the parish. Each farm has its own farmhouse, its own outbuildings, its own pattern of fields, its own family. The largest of these farms employs perhaps a dozen labourers, year-round and seasonal. The smallest is worked by a single family with 1 or 2 hired hands. The farms are the economic backbone of the parish. They produce the food that feeds the village, and the rents that support the gentry families, and the wages that keep the labourers in their cottages. Beyond the farms, 3 or 4 miles in various directions, are the other gentry houses, houses much like this one, occupied by families with whom the family in this house has been on visiting terms for generations. There are perhaps 6 or 7 such houses within visiting distance, ranging in size and income from substantially smaller than this one to substantially larger. The relationships between these houses are the social skeleton of the family's wider life. They dine at each other's houses, they attend each other's balls, they marry each other's children when the timing works, they write to each other when separated by distance. They follow each other's news with the close interest of people whose lives have been intertwined for years and will be intertwined for years to come. Then 4 miles away there is the market town. Let us call it Meryton, after the novel. Meryton is the town to which the family goes for serious shopping, for the assemblies in winter, for any business that the village cannot provide. It has perhaps 2,000 inhabitants, a high street with proper shops, a milliner who supplies the gentry ladies of the surrounding parishes, a bookseller who lends books from a small circulating library, an apothecary who provides medicines and minor medical advice, a subscription assembly room above the principal inn where the assemblies are held, a bank recently established, a weekly market on Wednesdays, a post office, an attorney, a surgeon, a clergyman in addition to the vicar of Meryton itself. Since the parish church there has both a vicar and a curate. The town is small by London standards, but it is for the surrounding parishes the centre of local civilization. When the family goes into Meryton, which is once or twice a week at most in winter, and more often in summer, they go in the carriage. The carriage is harnessed, the coachman drives, the mistress and 1 or 2 of the daughters ride. The journey takes about 3/4 of an hour. They go to the milliner, they go to the bookseller, they visit a particular friend, they take tea at a particular acquaintance's house in the high street. They return in the late afternoon with packages and gossip. The day in Meryton is, for the daughters in particular, a small event of considerable importance in a week that has otherwise contained no events at all. Then, beyond Meryton, beyond the parish, beyond the immediately surrounding world, there are the further connections. The mistress's sister and brother in another county, the married cousin in Kent, the aunt in London who occasionally has the family to stay for a fortnight, the military cousin who writes from a regiment quartered in the north, the uncle by marriage who visited last spring and is expected again in the spring to come. These distant connections form the wider social geography of the family, and through letters and occasional visits, they keep the family tied into a network that extends far beyond the parish boundaries. And then beyond all of this, the country, the kingdom, Europe, the world. The newspaper brings news of London, of Parliament, of the war that has been going on for so long now that nobody quite remembers what life was like before it. The war with France, which began in 1793 and has continued, with one short interruption, into the present moment. The English newspapers report Wellington's progress in the peninsula. They report the movements of the navy. They report the Emperor Napoleon's latest campaigns. The war is the constant background to all English life in this period. There are sons of neighbouring families serving in the army or navy. There are uniforms in the local towns when the militia is quartered there. There are subscription drives for the relief of soldiers' families. There are sermons preached on the duty of patriotism and the wickedness of the French. But the war is, for this family in this house in this Hertfordshire parish, quite distant. They read about it. They talk about it occasionally. They worry in a general way about the country's prospects, but they do not feel it directly, day by day, in the rhythm of their lives. The lane is the same. The fields are the same. The church bell rings on Sunday. The cook makes dinner at 5. The war, however vast its consequences, does not penetrate this house in any immediate physical way. This is the wider world the family inhabits, the parish, the neighbourhood, the market town, the distant relations, and behind all of these, the great events of the kingdom and the continent, registered through letters and newspapers and occasional rumour. It is a world with definite edges, definite social relationships, definite physical geographies. A young woman growing up in this house could draw, on a piece of paper, the whole shape of her social universe. Most modern young women cannot. The world has become too large, too diffuse, too easily reached by phone and screen to be drawable. In 1812, the world was drawable, and it was drawn mentally by everyone who lived in it. Before we move into the rituals of visiting, let us spend a few minutes on the simple practical question of how the family physically got from one place to another, because the carriage in a household like this was not just a vehicle. It was a piece of equipment that shaped, in concrete daily ways, what was possible and what was not. The family owns one carriage. It is kept in the coach house off the stable yard, under a canvas cover when not in use. It is a closed carriage with a hard top and glazed windows that can be lowered on leather straps. It seats 4 comfortably, 6 at a squeeze. It is painted a sober dark green, with the family's initial in small gilt letters on the door panel. It is perhaps 15 years old. It was bought second-hand by the master from a neighbouring family who were upgrading their own equipage, and it has been kept in working order ever since by the coachman and by occasional visits from a wheelwright in the market town. The carriage requires 2 horses to draw it. The horses are kept in the stable, fed by the coachman, exercised regularly to keep them fit, and harnessed when needed. To prepare the carriage for a journey is not a quick business. The coachman must be told in advance, often the day before, for any planned outing. He brings the horses out, harnesses them, leads them to the front of the house. He helps the family in. He climbs to his box. He gathers the reins. He sets off. The pace of a carriage on country roads in 1812 was, to our minds, slow. On a good road in good weather, perhaps 7 or 8 miles an hour. on a poor road less. In rain or mud, less again. The roads themselves, in the years before the great improvements brought by macadam later in the century, were variable in quality. The main turnpike roads, which were the principal routes between towns, were maintained by trusts that charged tolls and used the income for upkeep. These roads were in reasonable condition, although still rough by modern standards. The local lanes, the ones the family travelled most often, were maintained by the parish, which meant they were maintained when somebody got around to it, and the rest of the time were uneven, rutted, dusty in summer, deeply muddy in winter. A journey of 4 miles to the market town, in this carriage on these roads, took about 3/4 of an hour in good conditions. A journey of 15 miles to a more distant relation took the better part of 2 hours. A journey to London, 50 miles away, was a full day's expedition, with a stop at an inn for a meal and to change horses, and the family arriving tired and dusty at their destination in the late evening. Long journeys were planned. They were not undertaken casually. The family might travel to London perhaps once or twice a year to visit the mistress's brother and his wife who lived in town. Such a journey involved sending word ahead, packing trunks, arranging for the household to manage in the family's absence, planning where the carriage would be stabled in town, and undertaking the whole enterprise with a degree of seriousness that we now reserve for international travel. Within the more local geography, the carriage was used for any journey beyond easy walking distance, to church when the weather was poor, or when the family was going to a distant parish, to dinner at a neighbouring estate, to the market town for shopping or for the assemblies, to the larger county town occasionally for serious business or for medical consultations. The carriage was, in essence, the family's connection to the wider world, and the world that the carriage could reach in a reasonable time was the world they inhabited. Daughters did not, as a rule, travel alone in the carriage. There was always a companion, usually another sister, sometimes the mother, sometimes a maid. A young woman who travelled in a carriage by herself, particularly to any destination beyond the immediate neighbourhood, was making a kind of statement that her family had to be willing to back. The Bennet daughters, in their model, had each travelled alone in the carriage on rare occasions, but the default was company. Inside the carriage, on a long journey, the experience was a particular one. The seats were upholstered but not soft. The ride, on the iron-rimmed wheels and the leather-strap suspension of the period, was bouncy. The sound of the wheels on the road, the clop of the horses' hooves, the creak of the harness filled the small enclosed space. Conversation was possible, but had to be conducted at a slightly raised volume. Reading was difficult because of the motion. Most travellers simply sat, looked out of the windows, watched the landscape go past at its slow pace, and let their thoughts run. For the daughters of this house, a journey in the carriage was, despite its physical discomforts, a form of liberation. To sit in the carriage and watch the gates of one's own house disappear behind, and to know that for the next hour or two the world was going to be different, that one would see new lanes, new fields, new villages, new faces, was a kind of pleasure that nobody who travels often by car or train can quite recover. Travel, when it was rare, was an event. The senses sharpened, the smallest details registered. A strange church spire on the horizon was a thing to look at properly, because you might not pass this way again for a year. The windows of a particular cottage by the road might be the windows you remembered when you came back this way next spring, and might mean that you knew you were nearly home. There were also, of course, the discomforts. Cold in winter, heat in summer, dust on dry roads, mud splattered up by the wheels in wet ones, the risk of an accident, which was real. A wheel could break, a horse could shy at a sudden noise, the carriage could overturn in a particularly bad rut. People did die in carriage accidents. Most of the time, of course, they did not, but the risk was always present, and a long journey was, for that reason as well as others, undertaken with prayers said and provisions made. The carriage, in short, was a substantial fact of life. The horses had to be kept, the coachman had to be paid, the harness had to be maintained, the vehicle itself had to be repaired and eventually replaced. All of this was a continuous expense and a continuous management task, but without it, the family was effectively confined to walking distance of the house, which meant the parish, which meant a small handful of regular destinations. The carriage was, in a real sense, the instrument that made the family's social life possible. Every dinner, every assembly, every visit, every journey to London or to a relation in another county depended on the patient labour of the coachman and the steady work of two horses and the rolling wheels of an old dark green vehicle bought second-hand 15 years ago and still going. Now let us talk about visitors. Because the social life of a Regency country house was structured around visiting in a way that we have largely lost, and the rituals of visiting are essential to understanding what a typical day in this house actually felt like. The basic unit of social interaction was the morning call. A morning call, despite its name, was not paid in the morning as we understand mornings. It was paid in what the period called the afternoon, between the family's late morning breakfast and their late afternoon dinner, broadly between noon and 3 o'clock. The visitor arrived in a carriage or on foot, presented herself at the door, and was either received or not, depending on whether the mistress of the house was at home. To say a person was not at home did not mean they were physically absent. It meant they were not receiving callers that day. The phrase was a polite social fiction that everyone understood and accepted. If the mistress was at home, the manservant or the housemaid showed the visitor into the drawing room and announced her, and the mistress came down or rose to greet her. The visit lasted, by strict convention, no more than 15 or 20 minutes. To stay longer was a social error. To stay less was a slight. The conversation during the call was light, generally avoided controversy, and covered the small currency of country news, who had called recently, who had been seen at the assembly the previous week, what the weather had done, what the local minister had preached on Sunday. Tea was sometimes offered, sometimes not. Cake or biscuits might appear. After the proper time, the visitor rose, took her leave, and departed. A young woman of marriageable age, with mother in tow, paying a call on a young man's mother at his family's house, was one of the most loaded versions of this ritual. Everything was scrutinized: the dress, the carriage, the composure, the conversation, the nature of the parting, and every detail was reported back in the carriage on the way home, and again that evening at dinner, and again in letters to relatives over the next few days. Morning calls were a primary mechanism by which information about young people circulated through the social network of a county. Cards were left when the family was not at home. A small printed card with the visitor's name, sometimes with a corner turned down to indicate she had called in person rather than sending the card by a servant. The cards accumulated in a salver in the entrance hall. The mistress of the house went through them at the end of the week and made a list of who needed to be called on in return, and in what order, and how soon. Beyond morning calls, there was the larger and more substantial form of social engagement, the dinner. A family invited to dinner at a neighbouring house dressed carefully, set out in the family carriage well before the appointed hour, arrived in the early evening, were received in the drawing room, and went through to the dining room when the meal was announced. Dinner ran for 2 or 3 hours. The ladies withdrew from the dining room when the meal was done, leaving the gentlemen to their port. The gentlemen rejoined the ladies in the drawing room half an hour or an hour later. Tea was served. There might be cards. There might be music. The visit ended late, by the standards of the period, perhaps 11 or even midnight, and the family returned home through dark country lanes by the light of their carriage lamps. And beyond dinners there were the larger gatherings. The assemblies in the local market town held in the assembly rooms above the inn, with subscriptions paid by member families and dancing into the small hours, but the private balls at the wealthier houses, which were the great social occasions of the year, where every neighbouring family of consequence came in their best dresses and their best uniforms and their best calculations, and the daughters of the gentry were displayed to the eligible young men of the neighbourhood with all the careful choreography that such a display required. The Bennet daughters in our model would have lived for these events. They would have been the moments when the routine of the country house cracked open and something larger entered. New faces, officers from the militia regiment quartered in the area for the season, young men down from London visiting their relatives, cousins and acquaintances passing through. The small permanent neighbourhood was, for a few hours at an assembly, expanded into something with the potential for surprise. A daughter could meet a future husband at one of these. A daughter could ruin her reputation at one of these. The stakes, in the few hours that the candles burned in the assembly rooms and the music played, were considerably higher than the gaiety of the occasion would suggest. But mostly, life in this house was not balls. It was the long, quiet stretches between balls, the morning calls, the afternoon walks in the garden when the weather allowed, the evenings in the drawing room with the family alone, the slow rhythm of a country house in a small neighbourhood in a year that by our standards contained hardly any events at all. There was, however, one event that occurred reliably every week, and that brought together the entire parish in a way that nothing else did, and that I want to spend some time on before we move into the close of our day. That event was Sunday, and Sunday, in a country parish in 1812, had a shape and an importance that we have largely forgotten. Sunday began the same way as every other day, with the maids waking before dawn and laying the fires, but it diverged quickly. The cook prepared a cold dinner the day before, on Saturday, so that less work was required of the kitchen on the Sabbath itself. The household rose somewhat later than usual. Breakfast was unhurried. There was a particular Sunday quality to the air, a stillness, as if even the building itself had registered the difference of the day. The family dressed for church with rather more care than for an ordinary morning. Best cloaks, best bonnets, best gloves. The carriage was harnessed for those who wished to ride, although in this household, with the church only a mile off, most of the family chose to walk in fine weather. The walk to church on a Sunday morning was a small social event in its own right. You met other families on the lane. You exchanged greetings. You commented on the weather. You walked the last stretch in groups of 2 or 3, the parish converging on its central building from all the surrounding lanes. The church was, for everyone in the parish, the same church. The labourers came, the farmers came, the shopkeepers came, the vicar's family came, the gentry came. There was, in this single hour of the week, a physical gathering of the whole community that no other occasion in the year produced. People who lived 3 miles apart and rarely saw each other in any other context were, on Sunday morning, in the same building, breathing the same air, sitting in pews that faced the same altar, but the egalitarianism of the gathering was strictly visual. The interior of the church was carefully arranged to reflect the social order of the parish. The family in this house had a box pew, a high-walled enclosure with its own door and its own cushioned seats near the front of the nave on the side. The other gentry families had their own box pews. The lesser gentry, the prosperous farmers, the better tradesmen had pews further back, less elaborate, but still belonging to their families by long custom. The labouring poor sat on plain benches at the very back, or stood in the side aisles. Where you sat in church was, in essence, a published statement of where you stood in the parish. The service itself in the established Church of England in 1812 was a long affair. Morning prayer, with its responses and psalms and lessons. The sermon, which might run to 40 minutes if the vicar was in full flow. The hymns, sung to the accompaniment of a small organ if the parish was wealthy enough to have one, or to the leading of a parish clerk and a few skilled singers if it was not. The whole service might last 2 hours. The vicar of this parish was a respectable middle-aged man, married with 3 children, whose living, the income from the parish, was perhaps £400 a year, sufficient to keep him and his family in modest comfort. He was not a brilliant preacher. He read his sermons from a written text, in a voice that the parish had long since become familiar with. His sermons were drawn from a small library of approved volumes by other clergymen, supplemented occasionally with his own compositions. He preached the standard Anglican themes of the period: duty, patience, charity, the proper conduct of life, the hope of salvation. He did not preach anything that would have surprised or alarmed anyone in his congregation. That was, in the eyes of his bishop and of his parishioners, a sign of a good and dependable clergyman. Mary, in the family's box pew, listened more closely than her sisters. Mary loved the sermon hour. The vicar was not a brilliant man, but the structure of his arguments, the careful way he built one point on top of another, the slow, patient unfolding of moral truth, fitted Mary's mind precisely. She came home from church with quotations to copy into her commonplace book. She thought, in her solemn way, about what had been said. She incorporated what she had heard into the slow private theology she was building inside her own head, almost without intending to. Her sisters did not listen so closely. Jane listened politely. Elizabeth allowed her attention to wander, and looked at the patterns in the stained glass, and thought about what she would walk to in the afternoon. Lydia and Kitty whispered to each other when they thought their mother was not watching, and were occasionally cuffed for it. The mother nodded gravely at all the right moments, although she was, in fact, mentally cataloguing who was wearing what among the other gentry families, and would discuss it on the carriage ride home. The master listened with the particular detached half-attention of a man who has heard a great many sermons in his life and has formed his own private views on most of the topics under discussion. After the service, the parish poured slowly out into the churchyard. This was the social half-hour of the Sunday. The vicar stood at the door, shaking hands as people left. The gentry families paused on the path to greet each other. The farmers and tradesmen gathered in their own group near the lych gate. The labourers and their families moved more quickly through the yard and away towards the village. Information was exchanged. A new engagement was confirmed. A piece of news from London was passed along. The progress of an illness in a particular family was inquired after. The vicar asked after a sick parishioner. The mistress of this house spoke briefly with 2 other mothers about the next assembly, 2 weeks off, and what the prospects were for various daughters. Then the families dispersed to their carriages or their walks home. The walk back to this house took a leisurely 20 minutes through the lanes. The mother talked about who had been at church and who had not. The father walked a little ahead, alone, having had as much social interaction as he intended for the day. The daughters walked together in their pairs and singletons. By 12:30, the family was back at home, and the rest of Sunday lay ahead. Sunday afternoon was traditionally quiet. The household took a cold dinner around 2 o'clock, simpler than a weekday dinner because the cook had less to work with. After dinner, the family sat together in the drawing room. Sometimes a sermon was read aloud, by the master if he was inclined, or by Mary if he was not. Sometimes a chapter of religious poetry. The atmosphere was meditative, slow, somewhat duller than a weekday afternoon by design, because Sunday was understood to be set apart, to be quieter, to be devoted to reflection rather than to the ordinary occupations of the week. In the evening, the family might go to evening prayer at the church if anyone was so inclined, or might simply sit together in the drawing room with religious or improving books. By 9 o'clock, the day was winding down. By 10, everyone was thinking of bed. Sunday ended early, as it had begun, with a particular quietness that distinguished it from every other day of the week. This rhythm of the Sabbath, repeated every week, gave the year a punctuation that secular life now lacks. There were 52 of these days in every year, the same walk to church, the same gathering, the same sermon, or one very like it, the same return, the same quiet afternoon, the same evening. Around this fixed point the week organized itself. Saturday was the preparation day, Monday was the resumption day, Wednesday and Thursday were the heart of the week's working life. Sunday was the still centre. Time in a parish had a shape, and that shape was determined as much by the Sunday bell as by any clock. Now let us spend an evening here. Let us walk through, slowly, what the close of an ordinary day looked like, from the gathering before dinner to the moment everyone went up to bed. It is around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The family is in the drawing room. The mistress has changed her dress for dinner into something slightly more formal than what she wore in the morning. The daughters have done the same, with various degrees of attention. The master is somewhere in the house, perhaps still in the library, perhaps already in the drawing room, with a book or a newspaper. There is a fire. There are no visitors today. At 4:15, the manservant in the entrance hall strikes a small gong with a soft mallet. It is the first dinner gong, the warning that dinner will be served in 15 minutes. The family begins to gather. The youngest sisters drift in last, having spent the afternoon in their bedroom doing whatever they have been doing. The master closes his book and rises. The mistress checks the clock, smooths her dress, calls Mrs. Hill in to ask one final question about the cook's intentions. At 4:30, the second gong sounds. The family rises and proceeds in to dinner. The master leads, the mistress follows, the daughters come behind in a loose order. They take their seats. The manservant and Mrs. Hill enter with the soup. The dinner has begun. The food is what we would now call substantial. A typical dinner in a household of this size and means involved several dishes brought to the table together in the older fashion, or several courses brought sequentially in the newer fashion that was beginning to take hold. There is a soup, perhaps a clear consommé or a thicker mock turtle. There is a fish, if fish has been available, perhaps a piece of poached cod with a butter sauce. There is a roast, almost certainly, perhaps a leg of mutton or a sirloin of beef, or a brace of partridges depending on the season. There are vegetables from the kitchen garden, boiled and dressed with butter. There are sauces, both savoury and sweet in small dishes around the table. There are pies and tarts. There is, as the dinner proceeds, a course of sweet things, custards and puddings, before the table is cleared for what was called the dessert, which meant fruit, nuts, sugared confections, and wine. The wine is a careful matter. The master keeps a wine cellar in the basement of the house, with claret and burgundy and port and sherry and Madeira. He has views on what should be drunk with what. The ladies drink less than the gentlemen, but they drink. Wine at dinner was unremarkable for everyone, including the daughters, although the youngest were given more diluted versions or smaller glasses than their elders. Conversation at dinner was lively or quiet, depending on the day. With company, it was carefully managed. Among the family alone, it was less formal but rarely dull. The mistress raised whatever was on her mind. The master made his observations, often in a tone that the daughters had to work to interpret. The eldest daughters spoke freely. The youngest sometimes laughed too loudly and were occasionally rebuked. At the end of dinner, when the cloth had been removed and the dessert was on the table, the mistress rose. The daughters rose with her. They left the dining room and went through to the drawing room. The master remained at the table with his port, alone or with his sons-in-law if any were in residence, which in a household of 5 daughters was often the case once the marriages had begun. He stayed for half an hour or an hour, drank a glass or two, and joined the ladies. Tea was served in the drawing room around 6 or 7 o'clock. Tea, in a Regency household, was a different ceremony from what we know now. It was an event. The tea things were brought in on a tray, and the mistress, or sometimes the eldest daughter, presided over the urn or the kettle, and made the tea individually for each person. The tea itself, locked in its caddy, and dispensed in small spoonfuls, was the most expensive single commodity that the household routinely consumed. Sugar, also locked away, was added carefully. Milk or cream was offered. The whole process took perhaps half an hour, and was the centrepiece of the early evening. After tea, the drawing-room settled into its evening. The candles were lit in earnest now. The fire built up against the cooling air. The family arranged themselves around the room. The eldest daughter took up her embroidery. The second sat with a book. The youngest 2 whispered together on a sofa. The mother addressed letters or watched her daughters or fell into a small private worry about something. The father, having joined them, retired into a chair by the fire with another book. Mary, in her usual corner, went to the piano. She played for half an hour, with her usual mixture of seriousness and not quite success. Her sisters murmured in the background. Nobody listened in any focused way, but the music filled the room and gave the evening its sound, and Mary, at the keys, was almost happy. This was her moment in the household, the part of the day in which she was producing something that no one else could produce, even if no one else valued it as much as she did. After Mary finished, there might be cards. Whist was the most common card game in a household of this period, played with 4 people at a small table. Casino and loo were also popular. The card table was set up. The candles brought close. The play for stakes too small to matter went on for an hour. The conversation around it was casual and light. If there were guests, the entertainment was more structured. Music, recitations, conversation arranged around the abilities and inclinations of the company. If there were no guests, the evening drifted gently. Reading aloud was common. The eldest daughter, whose voice was pleasant, would sometimes read a chapter of a novel or a passage from a book of essays, while the others listened. The pages turned slowly. The fire burned down. The clock in the hall struck 9, and then 10 around 10 o'clock. In this household at this period, the family would think about retiring. There might be a light supper, a tray of cold meats and cheese and bread brought in by the manservant for those who wanted it. The daughters might take a glass of wine or a small cordial. The conversation became slower, fewer worded. The room itself had the heavy quality of a long evening at its end. By 10:30 or 11 at the latest, the mistress would rise. The daughters would rise with her. The master would close his book, mark his place, and stand. They would say their good nights to one another. The mother would kiss the youngest daughters on the forehead. The father would nod gravely at the older ones. Mrs. Hill would appear in the doorway with a tray of bedroom candlesticks. Each person would take one, lit from the drawing-room fire, and would carry it as they walked up the stairs to bed. This is the moment in a Regency house that I find, of all the moments, the most evocative. The procession up the stairs in single file, each person holding a small flame in front of themselves, the rest of the house dark around them. The bedroom doors opening in turn along the landing, the soft goodnights exchanged in the dark, and then the doors closing one by one and the candles disappearing behind them. Each person in their separate room set their candlestick on the bedside table. The maids had already been up to lay the fires and warm the beds with copper warming pans full of hot coals. The bedrooms were less cold than they would have been otherwise, but were not what we would call warm. The family undressed slowly in stages in the small island of light around their candle. A Regency woman went to bed in a long linen nightgown. Over the course of the day she had worn, in this order from the skin out, a chemise or shift of fine linen, a pair of stays which was a corset of sorts, a petticoat, a dress, perhaps a shawl. She had worn stockings tied with ribbons above the knee. She had worn slippers or light shoes. Her hair had been pinned up in some elaborate way that depended on her age and her style. Now in the bedroom by candlelight, all of this came apart in reverse. The shawl, the dress, the petticoat, the stays, each item placed on a chair or hung in the wardrobe, the hairpins removed one at a time and set on the dressing table. The hair brushed out, plaited loosely for the night, the chemise removed and the nightgown put on. The candle blown out, the bed entered. The bed was warm where the warming pan had been. The sheets were linen, smelling of lavender from the press in which they had been kept. The mattress was made of layers, sometimes feather over straw, sometimes wool over feather. The pillows were soft. The room around the bed was completely dark, with the heavy curtains drawn and no light from anywhere. The fire in the grate, if there was one, had been banked down to its embers and gave only the faintest glow. In the silence of the closed bedroom, the sounds of the country night came in. The wind, an owl perhaps, a fox in the fields, the slow creaking of the house adjusting to its empty hours. The other family members, settling into their own rooms along the same landing, the soft sounds of a brush being set down, a cough, a final word between two sisters in adjacent rooms. And then sleep, in the way that people slept before electric light, before constant low-level illumination from screens and street lamps and electric clocks, before the persistent hum of 1,000 small devices. Sleep that was, by all the evidence we have, deeper and earlier and less interrupted than the sleep most modern people experience. Sleep that came with the dark and lasted for the most part until the first light. Sleep in a house where the only sounds were the sounds of the house itself, This was the close of a day, repeated, with small variations, day after day after day, the same rooms, the same fires, the same procession of meals and tea and music and conversation, the same procession up the stairs at the end of the night with the same candles, the same beds, the same darkness, the same waking the next morning at the same hour to begin again. It was, by every modern standard, an extraordinarily small life. The family of this house, in any given year, perhaps left their estate twice. They might travel to London if there was business, or to a distant relation if there was a marriage or a death. They might go to Bath for the waters if someone was unwell. The rest of the time, week after week, month after month, they were here in this house, with these people, in this small green corner of Hertfordshire or Derbyshire or wherever the novel placed them. The horizon was the boundary of the parish. The world was the people who could be reached on foot or in a carriage in a single afternoon's drive. What does a life like that produce? It produces the kind of human being who is capable of noticing very small things. Because if your world is small, and the variations within it are subtle, you become attuned to subtlety. You learn to read the smallest changes in the people around you. You learn that the housemaid who sang yesterday is not singing today, and you wonder why. You learn that your father has read this particular book 3 times this year, and you wonder what he is looking for in it. You learn that your sister, who has been writing to a particular friend for months, has not received a letter back in 3 weeks, and you guess what that might mean. You learn the household. You learn the neighbourhood. You learn the patterns of the year as they repeated. The world was small, but it was deeply known. It was also, of course, in many ways, claustrophobic. The lack of privacy, the lack of independent income, the lack of options for the daughters, the way a single bad reputation, a single foolish choice could destroy a young woman's prospects forever. The way a daughter who did not marry well could become a dependent burden in some relative's house for the rest of her natural life. The constant pressure to be appropriate, to be visible in the right way, to never be the wrong kind of memorable. The Bennet sisters lived in a house full of love and warmth and music, and they also lived in a kind of social trap whose walls were invisible and constant. When you stand in the entrance hall of this house at midnight, with the family asleep upstairs and the fires banked down, and Mrs. Hill having done her last round and gone up to her own room in the attic, you are standing in a particular quietness that does not exist anywhere in our world anymore. A house with no electricity in it, a house with no machines running, a house where the only sounds are the clock in the hall and the small noises of an old building inhabited by living things at rest. A house lit, faintly, by the embers of a fire in the dining room and the moon if there is one through the staircase window, and otherwise utterly dark. This was their life, every night. The closing down of the house, the candles going out, the rooms returning to their darkness, the slow breathing of 7 women and 1 man and 7 servants in their separate beds across the building, the clock ticking on, the world turning, the next day waiting to begin. There is something I want to leave you with as we draw to the end of tonight's journey, something about what we have inherited from these houses and what we have lost. We have inherited, very obviously, the architecture. Houses of this period, built between roughly 1780 and 1830, are still standing in their thousands across Britain, occupied now by families of every kind, restored or modernized or left almost as they were. The proportions, the symmetry, the sash windows, the brick facades, the gravel drives, the walled gardens. These are the reference points for what an English country home looks like, even now, in the imaginations of people who have never lived in one. We have inherited the rituals of social life that descend from this period. The dinner party, although in a much modified form, the drawing room evening, although it is now called the living room, the morning coffee with a friend, which is the descendant of the morning call, the exchange of cards at Christmas, which descends directly from the calling cards of the Regency period, the careful management of who has been invited and who has not, who has reciprocated and who has not. We are not as formal as they were, but we still operate in many small ways on the framework that they built. We have inherited the novel, the interior life, the small social negotiations, the dinner conversations, the walks in the garden, the slow development of feeling between people who see each other constantly and have to work out, day by day and conversation by conversation, what they are to each other. Jane Austen, writing in this period, looking at houses very like the one we have been visiting, invented or perfected a kind of attention that has shaped almost every novel about ordinary life since. The closeness with which she watched Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet and their daughters changed the way English-speaking literature watches anyone. But we have lost something too, and it is worth saying clearly, because the loss is not always recognized. We have lost the constant company of that life. The way being one of 7 people in a relatively small house meant that you were always in the presence of someone. You woke to your sister's breathing in the same room. You ate every meal in the same company. You spent every evening in the same drawing room with the same people. There was no escape, except into a book or into your own thoughts, and even those were partial. Some people in this period found that suffocating. Others found that, when their lives changed and they ended up in different circumstances, they missed it more than they expected to. We have lost the pace. The slowness of a Regency day, which now seems unimaginable, was not boredom, although it could be that. It was a different relationship with time. You could finish a piece of needlework. You could play a piece of music until you could play it well. You could read a long novel slowly, over several weeks, and have the time to think between chapters. The hours did not move with the relentless small-scale efficiency of our hours. They moved with the long, deliberate arc of a country day, and the things you did within them were given their full, proper weight. We have lost the silence, or rather, the particular kind of soft, layered, never quite empty silence of a country house in an era before machines. The silence that was made up of clocks and fires and birds and floorboards, but that contained no buzz, no hum, no engine, no electronic note. The silence in which a single candle was a real source of light, and a single voice was a real event in the room. We have lost, perhaps most of all, the way of being known. In a house like this, with this many people in it for this many years, you were known by your family, by the servants, by the village, by the neighbours. They knew your habits, your handwriting, your favourite walks, the dress you wore last Tuesday, the cousin who never wrote to you, the small irritations you carried that you would not name. You could not be anonymous. You could not start over. You could not present a curated version of yourself to people who knew you only through that version. You were, for better or worse, transparently and completely yourself in the eyes of the people around you, and that was, simultaneously, a prison and a kind of holding. It was the absence of privacy. It was also the presence of being seen. In our time, with our different freedoms, we have gained things they could not have imagined. The ability to leave, the ability to choose our own household, the ability to be alone when we want to be alone, the ability to construct, very deliberately, who we are and who we show ourselves to be. We would not, most of us, swap our lives for theirs, and we are right not to want to. But there is something quietly worth honouring about the kind of life that this house contained, the dailiness of it, the patience of it, the way 7 women and a small staff and an invisible community of neighbours wove themselves together into a structure that held them, however imperfectly, through the years. The way the music played in the evenings even when nobody was listening, the way the candles were carried up the stairs, the way the doors closed along the landing one by one, the way the house, settling into its long quiet hours, contained their entire small lived world. Mary, in her bedroom at the back of the house, blew out her candle around 11. She lay in the dark for some time before she slept. She listened to the wind and the clock, and the small sounds of her sister Kitty in the room across the landing turning over in her bed. She thought, as she sometimes did, that nobody in this house particularly understood her, and that this was probably going to be true of every house she ever lived in. She thought about a passage from a book she was reading and tried to memorize it. She thought about her piano practice and decided to attempt the difficult section again tomorrow. She did not feel sorry for herself. Exactly. She felt, more than anything, the simple, deep tiredness of a long day in a full house. The clock in the hall struck the half hour. Somewhere, an owl called. The fire in the kitchen, banked low, gave out one last small pop as a coal collapsed. Mary closed her eyes. The house slept. Thank you for spending this evening with me, for walking with me through the rooms of a Regency country home and meeting the people who lived in it, and listening to the clocks and the floorboards and the quiet music in the drawing room. If something in this story stayed with you, if a particular detail surprised you or made you pause, or if you found yourself thinking about the people in your own life who, like Mary, are quietly noticing everything while no one is looking at them, I would love to hear it in the comments. These journeys are made for you, and your reflections keep them alive. There is another story coming, a different home, a different time, a different way that ordinary people lived their ordinary days inside the great frame of the past. And I think, if you are here, you are exactly the kind of person